My father slapped me across the face on his 60th birthday. "What kind of worthless junk did you give me?" he shouted in front of 50 wealthy guests. I ran out into the freezing rain with a bleeding lip, thinking my night could not get any worse. Then a black SUV pulled up in the dark, and two men dragged me into the back seat. The man waiting inside looked at me and said, "Hello, dear. I am your biological father. My name is Caroline, 33 years old, and I work as a corporate restructuring specialist." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who tried to break your spirit. The grand ballroom of the Pine Valley Country Club was completely suffocating. It was filled with 50 of the city's most elite residents, all gathered to celebrate the 60th birthday of Gregory, the man who adopted me when I was a toddler. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated seamlessly through the crowd, balancing silver trays of expensive champagne and delicate appetizers. I stood near the edge of the room, holding a small velvet box, my hands sweating with a nervous anxiety I could not shake off. I had spent the last 7 months tracking down this specific gift. It was a vintage 19th century pocket watch that had originally belonged to Gregory's own grandfather. I had paid a small fortune to a private collector just to get this piece of history back into the family. I truly believed this would be the moment Gregory finally looked at me with pride. I took a deep breath and walked up to the main table where Gregory was holding court with local politicians and business leaders. I handed him the velvet box. He popped it open, and the surrounding conversation went quiet. I waited for a smile, a nod, or even just a simple word of thanks. Instead, his face twisted into a deeply ugly mask of pure disgust. He lifted the antique silver watch by its delicate chain, dangled it in the air for a moment, and then violently threw it onto the hard marble floor. The sound of shattering glass and snapping metal gears echoed through the suddenly silent ballroom. Before I could even process what was happening, Gregory raised his heavy hand and struck me hard across the face. The slap echoed loudly against the high ceilings. My head snapped to the side from the sheer force of the blow, and I instantly tasted warm blood pooling on my bottom lip. "What kind of worthless junk did you give me?" Gregory shouted, his face burning red with rage. "Donovan just gave me the keys to a brand new Porsche, and you bring me actual garbage from a pawn shop." I stood there completely frozen in shock. The 50 wealthy guests stared at me with a sickening mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. My adoptive mother, Patricia, immediately lunged forward from her seat. She grabbed my arm and dug her manicured acrylic nails so deeply into my bare skin that I gasped in pain. "You have been a complete embarrassment since the day we took you in," Patricia hissed directly into my ear. "We gave you food and a roof over your head, and you repay us by humiliating your father in front of the mayor. Why can you not be more like your sister Brittany?" I looked over at my younger sister Brittany. She was 29 years old and the undisputed golden child of the household. She stood there in a designer silk dress, casually leaning against her husband Donovan. Donovan was a sharp and ruthlessly pragmatic 35-year-old African-American investment banker. He wore a custom-tailored suit and dangled the gleaming Porsche keys from his fingers with an incredibly smug expression. He had married into this family solely for their perceived wealth and status, and he knew exactly how to play their game. Brittany took a slow sip of her champagne and smirked at me. She loved watching me get humiliated. It was her absolute favorite form of entertainment. "You really thought a dusty old clock would impress, Dad?" Brittany laughed loudly enough for the whole room to hear. "You are so pathetic, Caroline. Just leave before you ruin the entire night." My cheek burned like fire. The humiliation was thick and suffocating. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a single scrap of basic affection from Gregory and Patricia. I had studied late into the night to build a successful career. I had navigated the brutal corporate world to become a top restructuring specialist. Yet in this room, to these people, I was nothing but a convenient punching bag. I looked down at the shattered pieces of the pocket watch scattered across the cold marble floor. It perfectly represented every wasted effort I had ever made for this toxic family. I forcefully pulled my arm out of Patricia's vicious grip. I did not say a single word. I simply turned around and walked straight out of the ballroom. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the country club and ran out into the night. A massive thunderstorm had rolled in while we were inside. Freezing rain poured down from the pitch-black sky. I did not have an umbrella or a coat to protect me from the elements. My expensive heels clicked sharply against the wet pavement as I hurried down the long, winding driveway of the golf course. The freezing rain mixed with the warm blood trickling down my chin. My mind raced with an explosive mixture of anger and despair. I had finally reached my ultimate breaking point. I decided right then and there that I would never go back to that house. I would never let them use me or abuse me again. The country club road was completely deserted and flanked by dense, menacing woods. The only light came from the occasional street lamp flickering weakly in the violent storm. I hugged my arms tightly around myself, shivering uncontrollably as my soaked dress clung heavily to my skin. Suddenly, a pair of blinding headlights cut through the heavy rain. A massive black SUV without license plates sped up behind me and swerved sharply, completely cutting off my path. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. Before I could turn around and run back toward the club, the back doors of the vehicle flew open. Two large men dressed in dark suits jumped out into the freezing rain. I tried to scream, but one of them grabbed me by the shoulders, while the other seized my arms. They easily overpowered my panicked struggles. They shoved me forcefully into the back seat of the SUV and slammed the heavy door shut behind me. The vehicle immediately accelerated, its tires squealing loudly against the wet asphalt. I scrambled backward against the leather seats, terrified that my adoptive father had sent these men to finish me off for embarrassing him. But as my eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light inside the cabin, I realized I was not alone. Sitting calmly in the opposite seat was an older gentleman with silver hair and piercing eyes. He wore an immaculate tailored suit and held a silver-handled cane. He looked at me with an incredibly soft and sad expression. "Please do not be afraid," the man said gently. "Hello, dear. I am Jonathan. I am your biological father." I slammed my fists against the heavy doors, screaming for help, but the thick, soundproof glass of the SUV swallowed every sound I made. The two men who had dragged me inside released their grip and climbed into the front seats, locking the doors with a sharp, heavy click. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I scrambled backward, pressing myself against the cold leather interior, my breathing shallow and fast. I wiped a mixture of rain and fresh blood from my lip, terrified that Gregory had finally decided I was too much of a liability and hired thugs to get rid of me. "Calm down," a deep, resonant voice commanded from the shadows of the opposite seat. The warm, yellow reading light above clicked on, banishing the darkness. Sitting across from me was an older man, perhaps in his mid-60s, wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. His silver hair was neatly swept back, and his hands rested calmly on the silver handle of a polished cane. He possessed an aura of absolute authority, but his piercing eyes looked at me with an unexpected, profound sadness. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking as I pressed my back harder against the door. "What does Gregory want from me now?" "Gregory wants what he has always wanted," the man replied smoothly. "Your complete submission." But Gregory did not send me. He reached out, his gaze locking onto mine. "Hello, dear. I am Jonathan. I am your biological father." A harsh, humorless laugh escaped my throat. "You are insane," I spat back, ignoring the stinging pain in my lip. "My parents died in a car crash when I was a toddler. Gregory and Patricia took me in. They remind me of their charity every single day. If this is some kind of sick joke to teach me a lesson for ruining Gregory's precious birthday, you can tell him to go to hell." Jonathan did not raise his voice. He simply tapped his cane twice against the floorboard. The heavy glass partition between us and the front seats glided up, sealing us in total privacy. He unlatched a pristine leather briefcase, resting on the seat beside him. "Gregory and Patricia are many things," Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register. But they are not your parents. They are your wardens. He slid a thick manila envelope across the center console. I stared at it, refusing to move. My mind screamed at me to ignore it, to treat this man as a lunatic, but my professional instincts, the very skills that made me a ruthless corporate restructuring specialist, demanded that I look at the data. I snatched the envelope, my wet fingers fumbling with the clasp. Inside lay a stack of documents. The first was a certified medical DNA test printed on secure laboratory paper. I scanned the columns of genetic markers, my eyes landing on the final conclusion highlighted at the bottom. Probability of paternity 99.9%. My breath caught in my throat. I flipped to the next page, uncovering yellowed 30-year-old court transcripts. "What is this?" I whispered, my eyes darting across old corporate charters showing Jonathan's name printed directly alongside Gregory's. 30 years ago, Gregory and I were partners, Jonathan explained, leaning forward, the sadness in his eyes replaced by a hardened, simmering rage. We built a massive financial firm from the ground up, but Gregory was endlessly greedy. When the federal auditors closed in on missing funds, Gregory needed a fall guy. He forged my signature on dozens of offshore transfers. He framed me for the embezzlement, effectively handing me a 10-year sentence in federal prison and stripping me of everything I had built. I shook my head, struggling to process the impossible information. But why would he adopt me? If he hated you, why would he take in your daughter? Why not throw me into the foster system? Jonathan pointed his cane at the last document in the stack. "Look at the trust deed, Caroline." I pulled out a heavy legal document embossed with a historic family crest. I quickly scanned the dense legal jargon, my professional training taking over. It was a generation-skipping trust fund established by Jonathan's wealthy grandfather. The principal amount was staggering, $50 million. But the stipulations were ironclad. The funds could not be touched, transferred, or leveraged by anyone until the primary beneficiary reached the exact age of 35. "Gregory did not adopt you out of the goodness of his heart," Jonathan said, his voice laced with venom. "He took you in to establish legal financial proxy. He and Patricia spent the last 30 years breaking your spirit, destroying your self-esteem, and isolating you from the world. They groomed you to be a weak, compliant scapegoat. They needed you absolutely terrified of them so that when you turned 35 in 2 years, you would sign over control of that $50 million trust without a single fight. You are not their daughter, Caroline. You are their retirement plan." The revelation hit me with the force of a freight train. Suddenly, 30 years of psychological torture made perfect, terrifying sense. It explained why they refused to let me attend college out of state. It explained why Patricia constantly mocked my appearance to keep me insecure. It explained why they celebrated my sister Brittany and treated me like a repulsive burden. I was never a family member. I was an asset maturing in their portfolio. My entire existence had been a calculated financial strategy. I sat in the silence of the SUV, the sound of the rain beating against the roof anchoring me to reality. The cold, trembling fear that had controlled me for my entire life evaporated in an instant. In its place, a dark, consuming fire ignited in my chest. Jonathan watched my face change. He sat back and folded his hands. "I have spent the last 2 decades rebuilding my wealth from nothing," he said quietly. "I run a private equity firm now. I have billions at my disposal. Say the word, Caroline. Give me permission, and I will call my team right now. I will destroy Gregory's company by morning. I will bankrupt him and leave Patricia and Brittany with absolutely nothing by the time the sun comes up. Let me fix what I could not prevent." I slowly looked down at the blood staining my fingertips. I pressed my thumb to my swollen, busted lip, feeling the sharp sting of the injury Gregory had just given me. I looked at the DNA test, then up at the man who shared my eyes. The man who had been stolen from me just as I had been stolen from him. I wiped the blood from my mouth. I felt my posture straighten, my shoulders pulling back as the timid, subservient daughter I had pretended to be completely died inside that car. "No," I said, my voice turning to absolute ice. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by my rejection. "You do not get to end this quickly." I continued, staring directly into his eyes with a cold, terrifying clarity. "I am a corporate restructuring specialist. I have spent the last decade tearing apart failing companies, finding hidden liabilities, and liquidating toxic assets. Gregory thinks I am just his worthless compliant accountant. I know exactly how he hides his money. I know the shell companies, the blind trusts, and the dirty ledgers he uses to fund Brittany's lavish lifestyle. I leaned forward, dropping the court documents onto the seat between us. Do not destroy him tonight, Jonathan. I want his company files. I want his debt profiles. I want to dismantle his entire life myself, piece by piece, until he has to look me in the eye and beg for mercy. The morning sun felt harsh against my tired eyes as I stood before the massive wrought iron gates of Gregory's estate. The violent thunderstorm from the night before had completely passed, leaving the manicured lawns slick and glistening. My busted lip was carefully concealed beneath a heavy layer of expensive foundation. I took a deep breath, forcing my shoulders to slump forward and my gaze to lower toward the pavement. It was time to play the part of the broken, subservient daughter they had spent 3 decades grooming me to be. I walked into the extravagant formal dining room. Gregory sat at the head of the long mahogany table, aggressively slicing into his breakfast steak while sipping a dark espresso. He did not bother to look up from his financial newspaper as my footsteps echoed against the polished hardwood floor. I stopped a few feet away, clutching my hands tightly together to simulate a trembling, pathetic anxiety. I am so sorry, I whispered, intentionally injecting a desperate waver into my voice. I ruined your birthday. I was ungrateful and completely out of line. Please forgive me. Gregory finally lowered his newspaper. His eyes were cold and filled with a victorious arrogance. He thoroughly enjoyed seeing me beg. He genuinely believed his physical abuse last night had successfully put me back in my designated place. You have always been a massive burden, Caroline, he said, with a cruel, satisfied sneer. You think a simple apology fixes the profound embarrassment you caused me in front of my elite investors. You owe this family everything you have. I nodded meekly, keeping my eyes firmly pinned to the floorboards. Tell me how to make it right, I said softly. Gregory leaned back in his plush leather chair, a deeply calculating gleam appearing in his eye. Vanguard Holdings is finalizing a massive corporate merger with a rival conglomerate next week. My accounting department is full of incompetent fools, and our internal ledgers are a complete disaster right now. You are going to use that fancy restructuring degree of yours to audit my books and clean up the digital files before the external auditors arrive, and you are going to do it for free. Consider it back rent for the 30 years I put a luxury roof over your pathetic head. I bowed my head submissively. Yes, Gregory, I will head to the office right now. Inside, my heart hammered with a dark, overwhelming triumph. His boundless arrogance blinded him. He had just voluntarily handed me the keys to his entire financial kingdom. Vanguard Holdings occupied the top 10 floors of a sleek downtown skyscraper. Gregory had intentionally relegated me to a windowless sub-basement archive room surrounded by towering, disorganized stacks of physical invoices and outdated server terminals. It was tedious grunt work explicitly meant to humiliate me, but it was exactly where I needed to be. I booted up the central network terminal and immediately began mapping the company's digital architecture. 2 hours into my deep audit, the heavy metal door suddenly creaked open. I instantly shrank back into my cheap desk chair, projecting the perfect image of a stressed, overworked subordinate. Donovan stepped into the dimly lit room. My brother-in-law looked completely out of place in the dusty corporate archive. He wore a pristine charcoal gray bespoke suit that perfectly tailored his athletic frame. His expensive leather shoes made absolutely no sound as he walked slowly toward my desk. Donovan was the company's leading investment banker. He was highly intelligent, ruthlessly pragmatic, and entirely motivated by profit and power. Why is the best corporate restructuring specialist in the city doing basic data entry in a glorified closet? Donovan asked, his deep voice bouncing off the concrete walls. I kept my head down hurriedly, shuffling a stack of meaningless tax papers. Gregory asked me to help prepare the files for the upcoming merger. I just want to make up for my terrible behavior at the party. Donovan let out a low, humorless chuckle. He leaned against the edge of my metal desk, crossing his arms over his broad chest. He possessed a terrifyingly sharp intuition that missed nothing. We both know you are smarter than everyone in that mansion combined, Caroline. So why do you let them treat you like a stray dog? I forced a tight, nervous smile, playing the role of the beaten-down sister-in-law. They are my family, Donovan. I owe them my life. Donovan shook his head slowly, his dark eyes analyzing my every microscopic movement. Family is nothing but a business transaction, he said flatly, stating his own harsh reality. I married your sister Brittany because her last name opens elite doors that my Ivy League degrees never could. But do not play dumb with me today. If you mess up these books and this merger falls through, my 8-figure commission vanishes into thin air. Do your little penance for Gregory, but stay entirely out of my way. I watched him turn and leave the room, his stern warnings echoing in the quiet space. He was incredibly smart, but his sheer arrogance blinded him just like the rest of them. He assumed my loyalty was tied to weakness and fear. He had no idea I was currently holding a lit match to his entire world. The absolute second the heavy door clicked shut, I dropped the timid act. My posture snapped straight and my fingers flew across the keyboard with lethal precision. I pulled a high-capacity military-grade encrypted flash drive from my purse and slotted it discreetly into the back of the terminal tower. Using a series of complex backdoor administrative overrides I had perfected during my career, I easily bypassed Vanguard's primary security firewall. I began cloning the company's entire central server. As the green progress bar slowly filled across the monitor, I manually dug through the restricted executive folders. I was specifically hunting for the hidden trail of my $50 million trust fund, but my eyes caught a heavily encrypted subfolder buried abnormally deep within the standard payroll registry. The file was labeled simply as Legacy. I ran a rapid brute force decryption script and forced the ledger open. My breath completely hitched in my throat as the numbers populated on the screen. I began frantically cross-referencing the outgoing offshore wire transfers with the company's internal employee retirement accounts. Gregory had not just been illegally siphoning money from my hidden trust fund to float his lavish lifestyle. He was actively running a massive systematic fraud operation right here within his own company. He was blatantly embezzling millions of dollars directly from the Vanguard Holdings Employee Pension Fund. He was stealing the life savings and retirement funds of his own loyal workers to artificially inflate the company's cash flow right before the merger. It was a severe federal crime carrying decades in maximum security prison. I quickly initiated a secure direct download of the Legacy Ledger onto my encrypted flash drive. The progress bar jumped to 80%, then 90%. My heart pounded violently against my ribs as the green line crawled forward. 95%. Suddenly, a tall, imposing shadow fell over my glowing screen. The heavy metal door to the archive room had opened without a single sound. The lock clicked shut with a deafening finality that made my blood run cold. I froze completely, my hand hovering just inches above the flash drive protruding from the tower. Donovan was standing directly behind me in the pitch-black room. I could feel the intense heat radiating from his rigid, towering posture. His sharp, dark eyes were locked dead onto the glowing progress bar, downloading the illegal files on my monitor. "What exactly are you downloading, Caroline?" Donovan's voice cut through the hum of the servers like a blade. I did not flinch. I let my hand drop casually from the tower and slowly turned my chair to face him. I kept my expression perfectly bland, channeling the obedient, unremarkable daughter he expected to see. "Gregory's tax files," I said, my voice steady. "The auditors are coming next week, and the 2022 to 2024 returns are missing key depreciation schedules. He asked me to consolidate them." Donovan stepped closer. The faint scent of his expensive cologne filled the small, windowless space. He leaned over me, his dark eyes scanning the computer screen. He was not Gregory. He was not blinded by ego or pride. He was a predator who survived on pure instinct, and he was incredibly dangerous. "Tax files," he repeated slowly, in a hidden encrypted subfolder labeled Legacy. "That is fascinating, Caroline. I did not realize depreciation required a brute force decryption script." My pulse hammered against my ribs, but I met his gaze without breaking. "When you hire incompetent accountants, Donovan, they tend to lock themselves out of their own servers. I am just doing the cleanup." He stared at me for a long, suffocating moment. Then his face relaxed into a cold, knowing smirk. He tapped his knuckles against the metal desk. "Let us get one thing straight," Donovan said, his tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I do not care what petty family drama you are tangled up in with Gregory and Patricia. I do not care about your little revenge fantasies regarding that stunt with the pocket watch at the country club. What I care about is the Vanguard merger. That deal represents a $20 million commission for me. It is my exit strategy." I raised an eyebrow. Exit strategy from the firm or from Brittany? Donovan let out a sharp, genuine laugh. He stood up straight, brushing a microscopic speck of dust from his bespoke lapel. "Brittany is a very expensive habit. I married into this family because Gregory promised me the keys to the kingdom. But looking at these books over the last 6 months, I am starting to realize the kingdom is built on sand. If you sabotage this merger and cost me my payout, I will ruin you. Do your little tax backup, Caroline. Just make sure the auditors see a clean company next week." He turned and walked out of the archive room, leaving the heavy metal door wide open. I let out a long, shaky breath. Donovan had just shown me his entire hand. He did not love my sister. He had absolutely no loyalty to my adoptive father. He was a mercenary entirely motivated by cash, and mercenaries could be bought, or better yet, cornered. I pulled the cloned flash drive from the tower, slipped it deep into my purse, and walked out of the building. 40 minutes later, I walked into the private dining room of a high-end steakhouse downtown. Jonathan was already there, sitting at a heavy oak table with a secure laptop open in front of him. He looked up as I locked the wooden door behind me. "Did you get it?" he asked. I tossed the encrypted flash drive onto the table. "I got everything. The offshore accounts, the dummy corporations, and the Holy Grail. He is embezzling from the employee pension fund, Jonathan. Millions of dollars diverted over the last 5 years to keep his personal real estate empire afloat." Jonathan plugged the drive into his laptop. His eyes narrowed as he rapidly scrolled through the raw data. A grim, deeply satisfied smile spread across his face. "Gregory always was a sloppy thief. He hides his greed behind his arrogance, just like he did 30 years ago when he framed me." "We are not going to the authorities yet," I said, taking a seat across from him. "If the SEC steps in now, the assets get frozen, the merger dies, and the bank takes the collateral. Gregory gets to play the victim of corporate mismanagement. I want him to feel the walls closing in. I want him to slowly realize he is trapped." Jonathan looked at me with profound respect. "What is your play, Caroline?" "Gregory is desperate for cash to cover the pension shortfall before the merger audit," I explained, pulling up a secondary screen on his laptop. "He has taken out massive high-interest loans against his own company. He leveraged everything to a private debt consortium. I want your hedge fund to buy out those loans today. Right now." Jonathan leaned back, steepling his fingers together. "You want to become his primary creditor." "Exactly," I said. "If your firm buys his debt, we own his financial leash. The second he violates a covenant, which he absolutely will, because the books are entirely fraudulent, we can call in the loans immediately. We can force him into default before the federal investigators even open a file. We will hold the deed to his entire life." Jonathan did not hesitate for a single second. He picked up his phone and dialed his chief financial officer. "Execute a quiet buyout of Vanguard Holdings mezzanine debt," he ordered sharply. "Pay a premium if you have to. I want total control of Gregory's paper by the end of the hour." We sat in the private room watching the financial monitors. I watched as the holding companies transferred the massive debt portfolios. It was a beautiful, silent execution. Millions of dollars changing hands in the blink of an eye, completely shifting the balance of power without a single drop of blood being spilled. In less than 45 minutes, the screen flashed with a final confirmation. I took a slow sip of my water. I was no longer the abused, unwanted daughter living under Gregory's thumb. I was the silent owner of his entire financial existence. He was a puppet, and I was holding the strings. Jonathan raised his glass of sparkling water. "To reclaiming what is ours." Before I could raise my glass to meet his, My cell phone vibrated violently against the wooden table. The caller ID flashed brightly. It was Patricia. I stared at the screen. She had not called me since the night I was slapped and thrown out into the freezing rain. I accepted the call and brought the phone to my ear. "What do you want, Patricia?" I answered coldly. "Caroline, you need to get back to the house immediately," Patricia screamed through the phone. Her voice was completely hysterical, stripped of all her usual country club arrogance. "Drop whatever worthless thing you are doing and get over here right now." "I am working," I said flatly. "If you need someone to yell at, call your actual daughter." "It is your sister," Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking with sheer, unfiltered panic. "It is Brittany. You need to come home right now. She has a massive emergency and you are going to fix it." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, a cold smile forming on my face. The dominoes were finally starting to fall. The drive back to this Pine Valley estate took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like stepping into an entirely different reality. I left Jonathan in that private dining room armed with the digital keys to Gregory's financial destruction, and prepared myself for whatever fresh hell my adoptive mother had waiting for me. I pulled my modest sedan up the long, winding driveway, parking far away from the gleaming luxury vehicles that usually crowded the front entrance. I pushed through the heavy oak double doors and followed the sound of dramatic, echoing sobs. I found my adoptive family in the sunken, formal living room. The space was a monument to their projected wealth, featuring vaulted ceilings, imported Italian marble floors, and original artwork that Gregory had undoubtedly purchased, using the money he had stolen from his own employees. Brittany was draped across a white velvet sofa, burying her face in a designer silk pillow. She was heaving her shoulders in a theatrical display of distress, but I noticed her eyes were completely dry. Patricia paced frantically back and forth across the Persian rug, clutching a crystal glass of gin. Her knuckles were white, and the heavy diamond rings on her fingers caught the dim light of the chandelier. Gregory stood silently by the massive stone fireplace, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked visibly in his cheek. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my tone carefully neutral. Patricia rounded on me instantly, her eyes flashing with a desperate, toxic panic. "Your sister is in trouble, Caroline," she barked, pointing a manicured finger at the sofa. "You are going to fix this right now." Brittany let out another loud, entirely unconvincing wail. "I am ruined," she cried, looking up at me with an expression that conveyed absolute annoyance rather than actual fear. "Donovan is going to kill me. He is going to leave me, and I will be a complete laughingstock." I crossed my arms, waiting for the actual facts. "What did you do, Brittany?" Patricia took a heavy swallow of her gin. "She has accumulated a rather unfortunate debt," Patricia said, waving her hand as if dismissing a minor parking ticket. "She got involved in some high-stakes underground poker games over the last few months. The people running these games are not the forgiving type. They contacted Gregory this morning. She owes $200,000 and they want the money wired by tomorrow afternoon." $200,000, I repeated, staring at the sister who had mocked me for buying a vintage pocket watch just 24 hours ago. "Tell your husband. Donovan makes that in a single quarterly bonus." "I cannot tell Donovan," Brittany shrieked, instantly dropping the crying act and glaring at me with pure venom. "Donovan thinks I am perfect. He thinks I am a sophisticated socialite. If he finds out I owe money to backroom loan sharks, he will file for divorce. He will humiliate me." And if Donovan files for divorce, Gregory's most important investment banker walks away from the Vanguard Holdings merger, I realized aloud, connecting the dots. If Donovan walks, the merger collapses. Gregory's head snapped toward me. His dark, furious glare confirmed I had hit the exact nerve. The entire family's house of cards rested on Donovan, keeping Vanguard's financial facade intact for the corporate buyers. Gregory needed Donovan to finalize the deal so he could quietly cover up the massive embezzlement I had just discovered in the pension fund. Brittany's gambling debt was a lit match, threatening to burn down Gregory's entire criminal empire. "So pay the debt," I said, looking directly at Gregory. "You live in a $10 million mansion. Write a check." Gregory's face turned an ugly shade of red. Vanguard's assets are currently frozen due to the pre-merger audit. He lied smoothly, unaware that I knew he was actually entirely broke and over-leveraged. All of my personal liquidity is tied up in escrow. I cannot move $200,000 without triggering an internal review by the merger committee. Patricia stepped forward, closing the distance between us. Her perfume was suffocating. That is where you come in, Caroline. You have that little downtown apartment. You have excellent credit because you never spend any money. You are going to take out a second mortgage on your condo right now. The bank will approve an emergency equity line by tomorrow morning. I stared at her, genuinely astounded by the sheer audacity of the demand. You want me to leverage my own home, the apartment I bought with my own corporate salary, to pay off Brittany's illegal gambling debts? We clothed and fed you for 30 years, Patricia sneered, her voice dropping to a vicious, entitled hiss. It is time you paid your sister back. She has a reputation to uphold. The absolute insanity of her statement echoed through the vast living room. They had stolen my $50 million trust fund. They had subjected me to decades of psychological torment. They had treated me like a repulsive burden. And now they demanded I plunge myself into massive debt to protect the golden child from her own reckless greed. No, I said firmly. Patricia gasped, stepping back as if I had struck her. Excuse me. I said no. I repeated, my voice steady and unwavering. I am not taking out a mortgage for Brittany. She created this mess. She can face her husband and tell him the truth. Gregory moved away from the fireplace. His movements were slow, deliberate, and predatory. He walked to a side table and picked up a thick legal document, his eyes locked onto mine with a cold, terrifying amusement. He did not look like a man asking for a favor. He looked like a warden reasserting control. You misunderstand your position in this family, Caroline. Gregory said, his voice a low, threatening rumble. You think you own that little downtown apartment? You think you are independent because you earn a paycheck. He threw the document onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a heavy, definitive smack. When you bought that condo 5 years ago, you used my preferred real estate broker? Gregory continued, a wicked smile twisting his lips. You signed a mountain of paperwork. You did not read the fine print. Your mortgage is legally held by a subsidiary shell company owned entirely by Vanguard Holdings. I am your landlord, Caroline. I hold the deed. I looked down at the document. It was a pre-drafted loan agreement transferring $200,000 of equity from my property directly into a blind trust controlled by Gregory. Sign this loan, Gregory commanded, pulling a silver fountain pen from his breast pocket and holding it out to me. Sign it right now, or I will initiate an immediate foreclosure. I will have the locks changed and have you legally evicted by midnight. You will have absolutely nothing. Patricia crossed her arms, a triumphant smirk returning to her face. Brittany leaned back against the velvet cushions, her panic completely vanished, replaced by a smug, entitled satisfaction. They all watched me, waiting for the familiar broken submission they had relied on for 30 years. I looked at the pen in Gregory's outstretched hand. I looked at the eviction threat lying on the glass table. My heart did not race. My hands did not shake. Instead, a wave of dark, electric amusement washed over me. Gregory was threatening to evict me using the power of Vanguard Holdings. He was trying to crush me with the weight of his corporate empire. What he did not know, what he could not possibly fathom in his wildest, most arrogant dreams, was that less than an hour ago, Jonathan's hedge fund had finalized the buyout of all Vanguard's mezzanine debt. I was secretly Gregory's primary creditor. I did not just own my apartment. I owned his company. I owned the mortgage on this very mansion. I held the absolute power to liquidate his entire life. I reached out and took the silver pen from Gregory's hand. I looked down at the extortion paperwork, my eyes flashing with a cold, terrifying anticipation. I did not say a word as I lowered the pen toward the signature line, preparing to give them exactly what they wanted, knowing it would be the very thing that buried them alive. The silver fountain pen felt heavy and cold in my hand. I stared down at the crisp white pages of the loan agreement, feeling the combined weight of Gregory, Patricia, and Brittany pressing down on me. They expected me to break. They expected tears, begging, and ultimate submission. Instead, my eyes rapidly scanned the dense blocks of legal text, my mind operating with the sharp, ruthless efficiency of a corporate surgeon. This was a standard Vanguard Holdings boilerplate contract. Gregory was so arrogant, so utterly dismissive of my intelligence, that he had not even bothered to have his lawyers draft a custom document. He had simply printed a standard subsidiary liability transfer and slapped my name on it. He assumed I would be too terrified of his eviction threat to read the fine print. He was wrong. Because I had spent the entire previous day auditing Vanguard's internal servers, I knew exactly how these specific contracts were coded. I knew the fatal loophole buried in Section 4, Paragraph B. The clause dictated that if the signatory acted in an official auditing capacity for the parent company, the debt liability automatically cross-collateralized with Vanguard's primary operating accounts to prevent subsidiary bankruptcy. Gregory had ordered me to act as his internal auditor just yesterday. He had created the very weapon I was about to use to destroy him. I kept my head bowed, hiding the cold, calculating smile that threatened to break across my face. I clicked the pen and moved to the signature line. I did not just sign my name. I deliberately added a tiny specific alphanumeric legal code right beneath my signature, invoking the cross-collateralization addendum. With 3 quick strokes of the pen, I completely inverted the trap. I did not attach the $200,000 gambling debt to my apartment. I attached it directly to Gregory's main corporate accounts, making it a toxic, highly visible liability on Vanguard's books right before the federal merger audit. I set the pen down on the glass table and took a slow step back, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. Brittany immediately lunged forward and snatched the document off the table. She held it up like a trophy, a vicious, triumphant sneer twisting her perfectly contoured face. She did not bother to read a single word of the legal text. She only cared that my signature was at the bottom. "You really are pathetic, Caroline," Brittany laughed, waving the paper in the air. "You talk a big game about being independent, but you always fold exactly when Dad tells you to. Enjoy paying for my new designer bag, sis. I hear the spring collection is absolutely stunning." Patricia took a long, self-satisfied sip of her gin, looking at me with absolute disgust. "Let this be a permanent lesson for you, Caroline. We clothed you. We fed you for 30 years when nobody else wanted you. It is about time you paid your sister back and actually contributed to this family. Brittany has a reputation to uphold. You are just a glorified calculator. Know your place." Gregory picked up the silver pen, securing it back in his breast pocket with a smug, arrogant finality. He looked at me as if I were a piece of dirt on his expensive Italian shoes. "Get out of my house," Gregory ordered coldly, "and have the rest of those archive files cleaned up by Friday. I will not tolerate any more of your insubordination." I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I simply nodded my head, turned around, and walked out of the grand living room. I kept my posture slightly hunched until I reached the heavy oak front doors. But the absolute second I stepped out into the cool night air, I stood up straight. I walked to my car with a light, purposeful stride. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and Gregory had locked the cage from the inside. The next morning, the sun rose over the towering glass and steel skyline of the financial district. Inside the massive, sleek boardroom of Vanguard Holdings, the atmosphere was thick with tense, high-stakes anticipation. The merger with the rival conglomerate was only days away, and the due diligence phase was reaching its critical peak. Donovan sat alone at the head of the massive obsidian conference table. He wore a crisp, tailored navy suit, his sharp eyes scanning through a towering stack of freshly printed financial contracts. He was the lead investment banker on the merger, and his entire career trajectory depended on these books looking absolutely flawless. He picked up the loan agreement Gregory had proudly handed him earlier that morning. Gregory had gloated about putting his rebellious, adopted daughter in her place, bragging about securing an emergency equity line to cover a minor, undisclosed personal expense. Donovan, always meticulous, did not trust Gregory's erratic financial maneuvers. He adjusted his cuffs and began to read the fine print. His eyes scanned down the pages, moving rapidly through the standard legalese. Then he reached the final page. He stopped. Donovan leaned forward, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. He stared at the signature line. He saw my name, but more importantly, his highly trained eyes caught the tiny, deliberate alphanumeric code written directly beneath it. Donovan was a master of corporate finance. He recognized the specific legal addendum instantly. He knew exactly what that code meant within the context of a Vanguard subsidiary contract. His eyes went wide. He quickly opened his secure laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he pulled up the company's live internal ledger. He cross-referenced the contract code with the primary operating accounts. The digital numbers flashed on his screen, confirming his absolute worst suspicion. The $200,000 loan was not secured by my modest downtown condo. It was hardwired directly into Vanguard's central corporate treasury. It was classified as a high-risk, unsecured liability. And because it was tied to an underground gambling syndicate, it was a massive, glowing red flag that would instantly trigger a federal investigation the second the merger auditors saw it. Caroline had not folded. She had planted a ticking financial bomb directly in the center of Gregory's empire. Donovan stared at the screen, his mind racing through the catastrophic implications. If he told Gregory, Gregory would panic, likely causing a scene that would alert the buyers. If the buyers found out, the merger would collapse, and Donovan would lose his $20 million commission. He slowly reached for his cell phone resting on the polished table. He unlocked the screen and pulled up Gregory's contact file. His thumb hovered directly over the call button. He needed to warn his father-in-law. He needed to tell him that his compliant, broken adopted daughter had just legally outmaneuvered him. But Donovan paused. He looked at the glowing numbers on his screen. He thought about his wife, Brittany, and the endless stream of toxic, entitled demands she made. He thought about Gregory's suffocating arrogance and how the old man constantly treated him like a hired subordinate rather than an equal partner. Donovan's loyalty had never been to the family. His loyalty was solely to power, leverage, and money. A slow, cold smile spread across Donovan's face. He lowered his thumb. He clicked the phone screen dark and placed it face down on the boardroom table. He picked up the signed contract, carefully slid it into a highly confidential red folder, and locked it inside his briefcase. He chose not to tell his father-in-law a single thing. "Look at that hemline. Did you buy that off a clearance rack at a discount department store?" Patricia's voice sliced through the gentle hum of the string quartet playing in the corner of the grand dining room. She leaned across the massive mahogany table, speaking directly to the wives of the Vanguard board members, but making absolutely certain her voice carried to the far end of the room where I was seated. I sat rigidly in my chair, positioned mere inches from the swinging kitchen doors. Waiters in crisp white uniforms continuously brushed past my shoulder, carrying silver trays heavy with roasted duck truffle risotto and crystal decanters of vintage Bordeaux. I was practically cast in shadow, purposefully seated as far away from the center of power as physically possible. Patricia took a delicate sip of her wine and placed a heavily jeweled hand on Brittany's arm. Brittany simply understands the immense weight of the Vanguard legacy. She is the true heir to this empire. She carries our name with absolute grace, while some people— Patricia shot a vicious sideways glare down the length of the table in my direction— seem entirely determined to look like the hired help. I told Gregory years ago that blood always tells. You can adopt a stray child, you can give it a room in a mansion, but you cannot force it to understand high society. Brittany preened under her mother's praise, smoothing the fabric of her $10,000 evening gown. She had entirely forgotten that just a week ago she was sobbing hysterically on a velvet sofa, terrified of a massive underground gambling debt. She looked at me with a smug, victorious smirk, fully believing I was currently mortgaging my future to pay for her reckless mistakes. Gregory stood up at the head of the table, tapping his crystal goblet with a heavy silver spoon. The room immediately fell into a respectful silence. Donovan sat to his right, perfectly composed in a custom-tailored tuxedo. He looked like a shark resting in shallow water. "Tonight, we are not just celebrating family," Gregory announced, his voice booming with absolute authority. "We are celebrating the future. The Vanguard merger will be officially finalized in exactly 48 hours. This monumental deal cements our legacy. It secures our wealth and our influence for generations to come." Gregory turned his proud, beaming gaze toward his son-in-law and his biological daughter. To Donovan, the brilliant architect of this incredible financial milestone, and to my beautiful daughter, Brittany, the shining star of the Vanguard name. Every board member and their wives raised their glasses in unison. To Vanguard, they murmured collectively. No one looked at me. No one acknowledged the silent adoptive daughter in the cheap dress sitting next to the kitchen doors. I was a ghost in my own family's home, a convenient scapegoat kept around only to manage their messes and absorb their scorn. I caught Donovan's eye across the vast expanse of mahogany and crystal. He slowly raised his champagne flute to his lips and took a deliberate sip. He knew. He had read the fine print of the loan agreement I signed last week. He knew that Brittany's $200,000 debt was currently sitting like a ticking financial bomb inside Vanguard's primary operating accounts. He knew I had intentionally cross-collateralized Gregory's entire corporate structure, shifting the liability straight into the company's treasury. Yet Donovan sat there completely silent, smiling at his father-in-law and letting the arrogant old man dig his own corporate grave. Donovan was a mercenary waiting to collect the spoils, and he knew I had just handed him the match to burn it all down. Gregory remained standing, soaking in the blind admiration of his peers. He looked down the length of the table and finally acknowledged my presence with a cold, dismissive sneer. "Caroline," Gregory barked, treating me like a servant in front of the most powerful executives in the city. "Have the kitchen staff bring out the dessert service immediately. We are ready." It was the ultimate insult, the absolute peak of his lifelong arrogance. He expected me to jump up, push through the swinging doors, and fetch his cake. I did not move toward the kitchen. Instead, I placed my hands on the edge of the table and pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly and harshly against the imported Italian marble floor. The sharp, grating noise drew the immediate attention of every single guest. I stood up slowly, picking up my simple glass of tap water. "I would like to propose a toast," I said. My voice was not loud, but it possessed a cold, metallic edge that sliced through the heavy silence of the dining room, commanding absolute attention. Patricia scowled, her face flushing with anger. "Sit down, Caroline. You are embarrassing yourself and ruining a professional dinner." I ignored her entirely, keeping my eyes locked on Gregory. He glared at me, his jaw tightening with irritation and impatience. He clearly thought I was about to make a pathetic, desperate plea for their affection. "To Gregory," I said, holding my water glass up in the air. The room was deathly quiet. I let the silence stretch for one agonizing second before delivering the fatal blow. "May your assets be as secure as your employee pension fund." The words hung in the air, heavy, precise, and completely lethal. The Vanguard board members exchanged confused, uncomfortable glances. Brittany rolled her eyes, entirely too ignorant to understand the catastrophic weight of the statement. Patricia looked bewildered, but Gregory understood. His arrogant, triumphant smirk vanished instantly. The color drained from his face at a terrifying speed, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His hand began to tremble violently. The expensive red wine sloshed dangerously close to the rim of his crystal goblet, spilling over the edge and staining his crisp white cuff. He stared at me with wide, terrified, unblinking eyes. The pension fund. The hidden, heavily encrypted subfolder on his private server labeled Legacy. The millions of dollars he had secretly and systematically embezzled over the last 5 years to keep his failing personal real estate empire afloat. He realized in that exact split second that I had seen the true books. He realized I had the raw data. He realized I knew his darkest, most destructive criminal secret. His mouth opened, but his throat seized. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the crushing impact. "You." Gregory choked out his voice, a ragged, breathless whisper of pure terror. "How did you?" Before he could scream, before he could demand answers or order his private security to drag me out of his house, a sharp, piercing ringtone shattered the silence. It was Gregory's personal cell phone resting on the table right next to his dinner plate. He looked down at this glowing screen. The caller ID flashed brightly, illuminating the dark wood for everyone nearby to see. It was the executive branch of Vanguard's primary lending bank. Commercial banks did not call their top corporate clients at 9 o'clock on a Friday night unless a catastrophic financial trigger had been tripped. The cross-collateralized debt from the loan agreement had finally hit the main ledger. The algorithmic red flags were waving. The emergency audit alarm was sounding. Gregory stood entirely frozen, staring at the ringing phone as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The entire boardroom watched him, waiting for their fearless leader to answer. I slowly lowered my glass and took my seat next to the kitchen doors, a cold, serene smile settling perfectly on my face. The mighty Vanguard empire was finally collapsing. The shrill, relentless ringing of Gregory's personal cell phone cut through the stunned silence of the dining room. He stared at the glowing screen as if it were a live grenade. The caller ID displayed the executive branch of his primary commercial bank. A call from the head of corporate lending at 9 o'clock on a Friday night meant only one thing: absolute catastrophe. Gregory snatched the phone from the table, his hand trembling so violently that he nearly dropped it. He offered a tight, suffocatingly fake smile to the confused Vanguard board members and their wives. He turned on his heel and practically sprinted out of the dining room, his heavy footsteps echoing as he retreated into the cavernous, vaulted hallway. I remained perfectly still in my chair near the kitchen doors. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my ice water. At the far end of the table, Donovan caught my gaze. His expression was a masterclass in professional neutrality, but his eyes betrayed a cold, calculating understanding. He offered me a slow, microscopic nod. He knew exactly what was happening on the other side of those mahogany doors, and he was choosing to sit in silence while his father-in-law's empire burned to the ground. Through the thick walls, Gregory's muffled voice began to bleed into the dining room. At first, his tone was authoritative, demanding to know why his celebration was being interrupted. Then the cadence shifted abruptly. His voice dropped an octave, rising again into a frantic defensive panic. He sounded like a man drowning. I could perfectly envision the conversation happening in the hallway. The bank executive was currently informing him that Vanguard Holdings had triggered a catastrophic breach of financial covenants. The $200,000 loan was not the actual problem. The problem was the cross-collateralization addendum I had legally invoked with my signature. By tying a high-risk, unsecured illegal gambling debt directly into the heart of the company's primary treasury, I had violated the core terms of Gregory's master credit facility. Worse, the bank executive was explaining that Vanguard's debt portfolio was no longer held by their institution. It had been aggressively acquired just hours prior by a private equity firm. That anonymous firm was now exercising its absolute legal right to call in the entirety of the loans immediately due to the covenant breach. Hundreds of millions of dollars were now due in full. The heavy mahogany doors flew open with a violent crash. Gregory stormed back into the formal dining room. His face was no longer pale. It was flushed, a deep, dangerous crimson. The polite dinner conversations halted instantly. Patricia froze, her heavily jeweled hand hovering in the air. Brittany looked up, her smug satisfaction replaced by sudden, raw confusion. Gregory ignored the elite board members. He ignored the catered food, the expensive crystal, and the carefully curated illusion of wealth. He marched directly past his wealthy guests, his eyes locked onto me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He stopped directly behind my chair. Before I could stand, he reached down and grabbed my upper arm. His fingers dug into my flesh with bruising, unrestrained force. "Harold! What on earth are you doing?" Patricia hissed, scandalized by the sudden physical outburst in front of her high society circle. "You are making a scene." Gregory did not answer her. He yanked me upward, practically dragging me away from the table. The wives gasped in unison. A few of the board members half stood, unsure if they should intervene, but Gregory's terrifying manic expression kept them rooted to their seats. I did not struggle. I let him pull me out of the dining room, down the long, shadowed corridor, and straight into his private study. He shoved me inside and slammed the heavy oak door shut, turning the deadbolt with a sharp, violent click. The sound isolated us entirely from the party outside. "What did you do?" Gregory roared, his voice shaking the framed degrees on his walls. "What exactly did you do to that loan agreement?" I smoothed the front of my cheap dress, maintaining my absolute composure. I signed it, Gregory. Exactly as you and Patricia demanded. I secured the equity line to pay off Brittany's underground poker debts. I kept your golden child safe. Do not play games with me, he bellowed, slamming both fists onto his massive desk. The bank just called. They froze all operating accounts. They said a private equity firm bought up our entire debt portfolio and called in the loans. They claimed the signature on the subsidiary transfer triggered a total breach of our financial covenants. How could a simple residential mortgage document trigger a corporate default? I looked him dead in the eye, dropping the obedient daughter facade forever. Because I am not just a glorified calculator, Gregory. I know your corporate structure better than you do. You used a standard Vanguard boilerplate contract for that loan. You assumed I would be too intimidated by your eviction threat to read the fine print. Gregory stared at me, his chest heaving as he struggled to comprehend my words. Section 4. Paragraph B. I recited calmly, my voice dropping to a surgical precision. If the signatory acts in an official auditing capacity for the parent company, the debt liability automatically collateralizes with the primary operating accounts. You ordered me to act as your internal auditor. When I signed that paper, I included the specific alphanumeric code that activated the clause. I tied a toxic, illegal gambling debt directly into the heart of Vanguard Holdings. Gregory staggered back as if I had been physically struck. He gripped the edge of his desk for support. You crashed the entire company over $200,000. No. I corrected, a cold smile touching my lips. I crashed the company because of who bought the debt. The private equity firm that purchased your loans and called them in tonight is directed by me, and it is funded by Jonathan. The name hit him like a physical blow. The color drained from his face entirely. Jonathan, he whispered, the arrogance completely stripped from his voice. Jonathan is in federal prison. Jonathan was exonerated, I said smoothly. He spent 30 years rebuilding his life, while you spent 30 years running Vanguard into the ground. He owns your debt, Gregory. He holds the leash now. The Vanguard merger is dead. Your assets are frozen. You have absolutely nothing. Gregory's face twisted into a mask of pure primal rage. He lunged toward me, raising his hand, clearly intending to strike me and reassert his dominance. I will destroy you. He spat, his fingers tightening around my arm once again. I will tie you up in litigation until you rot. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm. I did not flinch. With a sharp, practiced motion, I twisted my wrist and violently wrenched my arm free. He stumbled forward, caught completely off guard by my sudden physical resistance. He was old, weak, and entirely out of options. You are in no position to destroy anyone, I stated, my voice echoing with absolute finality in the quiet study. While you were out there toasting to your brilliant legacy, I just filed a comprehensive whistleblower report with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Gregory froze. The anger in his eyes was instantly replaced by unadulterated terror. I sent them the heavily encrypted subfolder from your private server. I continued, stepping closer to him so he could hear every single word. The folder labeled Legacy. I gave them the raw data detailing the millions of dollars you systematically embezzled from the employee pension fund over the last 5 years to cover your personal real estate losses. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed. The SEC investigators are already reviewing the files, I told him, turning toward the locked door. You have exactly 48 hours to find the $10 million you stole and return it to the pension fund. If that money is not back in the accounts by Monday morning, the federal agents will be waiting at your front door, and you will go to federal prison. I unlocked the heavy oak door and pulled it open. The faint sound of the string quartet drifted back into the study. Gregory remained standing by his desk, clutching his chest, breathless and gasping for air, as his entire world collapsed around him. I did not look back. I stepped out into the hallway and walked away, leaving him suffocating in the wreckage of his own blind ambition. Gregory had not told them the truth. That was the only logical conclusion I could draw when my phone buzzed the following afternoon with a sharp, demanding text from Patricia. She ordered me to present myself at the estate immediately. Gregory was a coward to his very core, Faced with the absolute certainty of federal prison and total financial annihilation, he had chosen to hide in his study, likely drinking himself into a stupor while leaving his wife entirely in the dark. He had clearly spun some frantic, desperate lie to Patricia about a temporary cash flow crisis. He likely disguised his panic as a minor temporary hurdle in the Vanguard merger that required immediate emergency capital to smooth over the auditors. He had given Patricia the exact number he needed to survive: $10 million. He just lacked the spine to tell her why he needed it so urgently, or that his quiet, obedient adopted daughter was the one holding the executioner's axe over his neck. Patricia, ever the social climber and ruthless manipulator, had immediately decided to solve the family problem the only way she knew how. She decided to sell me. I walked into the sunlight-flooded conservatory at the back of the Pine Valley mansion. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of blooming orchids and expensive perfume. Patricia sat rigidly in a wicker lounge chair, her posture perfect, her eyes darting with a frantic, suppressed anxiety she was desperately trying to hide. Sitting directly across from her was Arthur Harrington. Harrington was a 60-year-old real estate tycoon whose reputation in the financial district was universally despised. He was a man who built his fortune on hostile takeovers, predatory lending, and exploiting vulnerable assets. He wore a custom-tailored suit that completely failed to hide his declining heavy physique. His skin was mottled, his eyes were small and predatory, and the distinct, nauseating smell of stale cigars and heavy scotch hung in the air around him. He looked up as I entered the room, his gaze sweeping over me with a vile, evaluating hunger. He did not look at me like a person. He looked at me like a piece of distressed property he was about to acquire at a steep discount. "Sit down, Caroline," Patricia ordered, her voice brittle and sharp. "We have incredibly important family business to discuss, and we do not have time for your usual difficult attitude." I did not sit. I remained standing just inside the doorway, my hands relaxed at my sides, watching the pathetic spectacle unfold. "What do you want, Patricia?" Patricia forced a painfully bright, completely unnatural smile as she gestured toward the repulsive man sitting across from her. "You remember Mr. Harrington from the country club galas? He is a very close, very generous friend of this family. Your father is currently finalizing the Vanguard merger, and we simply need a temporary infusion of capital to ensure the corporate transition goes smoothly." Harrington leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on his knees. He smiled, revealing slightly yellowed teeth. "Your mother and I have had a very productive conversation this morning, Caroline. I have always admired your quiet intensity. You are entirely different from the usual superficial women in this city. You have fire. I appreciate fire in a woman." A cold wave of disgust washed over me, but I kept my expression perfectly blank. Patricia stood up, moving closer to me. Her eyes were wide with a manic, unhinged desperation. She actually believed she was orchestrating a brilliant financial rescue. She actually believed she still had absolute power over my life. "Mr. Harrington is willing to invest $10 million in your father's company if you agree to marry him," Patricia stated, her voice trembling with a toxic mixture of command and panic. "Pack your bags, you're moving into his penthouse." I stared at her genuinely, marveling at the depths of her delusion. She was attempting to traffic her adopted daughter to a sleazy, aging predator to cover a corporate deficit she did not even comprehend. She thought my life, my body, and my future were simply assets she could liquidate to maintain her country club memberships and her imported Italian marble floors. "It is a remarkably generous offer," Patricia continued, misinterpreting my silence as submission. "You are 30 years old, Caroline. You are not getting any younger, and you certainly lack the natural grace your sister possesses. A man of Mr. Harrington's immense wealth and stature wanting to provide for you is a miracle. You will sign a standard prenuptial agreement, of course, but your lifestyle will be elevated far beyond anything you could achieve on your own. You owe this family your absolute obedience." Harrington chuckled, a low, wet sound that made my skin crawl. He stood up slowly, stepping toward me with the overwhelming confidence of a man who believed his money allowed him to purchase anything breathing. He stopped mere inches away from me. I could feel the heat radiating from his heavy frame. "Come now," Caroline Harrington murmured, his voice dropping to a patronizing, intimate purr. "Do not look so frightened. We are going to have a highly mutually beneficial arrangement. I promise to take exceptionally good care of you." Harrington raised his hand and reached out. He placed his thick, clammy palm directly onto my waist, intending to pull me against him to seal the transaction. My reaction was instantaneous, brutal, and entirely devoid of hesitation. Before his fingers could even tighten around the fabric of my dress, my hand shot out. I grabbed his thick wrist with a crushing, unrelenting grip. I did not pull away. I stepped directly into his space and twisted his arm sharply backward and down. The sudden, violent application of torque locked his joints and sent a blinding shock of pain through his shoulder. Harrington let out a pathetic, breathless yelp. His knees buckled instantly under the intense physical pressure, and he staggered downward, his expensive shoes slipping on the polished tile floor. He stared up at me, his predatory confidence entirely shattered, replaced by wide-eyed, trembling shock. He had expected a submissive, frightened girl. He found a woman who had spent years auditing the darkest, most dangerous corners of corporate finance, learning exactly how to neutralize predators. I leaned down, keeping his wrist locked in a punishing grip, bringing my face inches from his sweating forehead. My voice was a dead, quiet whisper that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "Touch me again, and I'll ensure the IRS audits your offshore accounts." I said, my tone laced with absolute venom. "I know exactly where you hide your money, Arthur. I know about the Cayman shell companies you use to shelter your commercial real estate profits. I know about the dummy corporations in Belize. You wire $10 million to Gregory, and I will personally hand-deliver the routing numbers to federal investigators before the sun sets. I will see your entire empire dismantled, and I will watch you rot in a federal penitentiary." Harrington's face turned an ashen, sickly white. The greed in his eyes completely vanished, replaced by an absolute primal terror. He understood immediately that I was not bluffing. He understood I possessed the exact knowledge required to destroy his life. I released his wrist with a sharp shove. He stumbled backward, clutching his arm against his chest, gasping for air like a frightened animal. He did not say a single word. He turned and practically ran out of the conservatory, leaving Patricia standing completely paralyzed in the center of the room. Patricia stared at the empty doorway where her $10 million salvation had just fled, and then she turned to look at me. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged hatred. She realized the money was gone. She realized her control was gone. She realized her perfect, affluent world was collapsing, and she blamed me for pulling the final pillar away. "You ungrateful, malicious wretch!" Patricia screamed, her voice cracking with sheer hysteria. Her hands shook violently at her sides. "After everything we gave you, after everything we sacrificed to keep you in this home, you have ruined us. You are a monster. You are dead to us. Do you hear me? You are completely dead to this family." I looked at the woman who had spent decades making me feel entirely worthless. I felt absolutely nothing for her. No anger, no sadness, no pity. Just a cold, final sense of absolute closure. I smiled. "I know." The morning sun illuminated the towering glass windows of the financial district, but inside the sprawling Pine Valley estate, a suffocating blanket of denial had settled over Patricia and Brittany. Gregory had remained locked inside his private study since the previous night, refusing to answer the frantic knocking of his wife. Instead of demanding the truth about why the Harrington investment had violently imploded, Patricia chose her favorite time-tested coping mechanism: blind, arrogant consumerism. She convinced herself that Gregory was merely experiencing a routine corporate headache. The Vanguard merger gala was only 36 hours away, and Patricia was entirely determined to project an image of untouchable elite perfection. She dragged Brittany out of the mansion and ordered their private driver to take them directly to Maison Vinet, the most exclusive invite-only boutique in the city's luxury quarter. Maison Vinet was a temple of high fashion. The floors were cut from seamless white marble, the air smelled of white lilies, and the price tags routinely rivaled the cost of luxury vehicles. Patricia and Brittany swept through the heavy glass doors like conquering royalty, demanding champagne and immediately ordering the floor attendants to pull the newest imported silk gowns. They moved deeper into the boutique, their heels clicking sharply against the marble until they reached the private VIP viewing lounge. Brittany pushed past the velvet partition, ready to demand the plush center seating area, but she stopped dead in her tracks. I was already there. I sat comfortably on a tufted emerald sofa, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. Resting on the low glass table in front of me was a steaming cup of espresso. Sitting directly across from me was Jonathan. Jonathan looked nothing like the broken man Gregory had framed and sent to federal prison years ago. He wore a midnight blue suit that spoke of quiet, limitless wealth. Silver threaded through his dark hair, and his sharp, calculating eyes carried the terrifying authority of a man who now owned the debt of half the city. We were not there to shop. We were finalizing the liquidation schedule for Vanguard Holdings. Brittany's face twisted into an ugly, visceral sneer the absolute second she registered my presence. She marched into the lounge, completely ignoring Jonathan, and slammed her expensive handbag down onto a display table. Julian Brittany barked, summoning the boutique manager without bothering to look at him. Julian, a tall, impeccably dressed man, stepped into the lounge with a look of deep professional distress. "Yes, Miss Vanguard." Julian replied smoothly, his hands clasped behind his back. "I need you to lock down this wing of the store immediately," Brittany demanded, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "I require a private fitting for the gala, and I absolutely refuse to share oxygen with this parasite. I have no idea how she even got past your front door. Her credit limit could not buy a silk scarf in this establishment." Patricia glided into the room right behind her daughter, crossing her arms and glaring at me with venomous disgust. "Brittany is entirely correct, Julian. This girl is an estranged, ungrateful charity case. We clothed her, we fed her, and we tolerated her miserable presence in our home for decades. Now she stalks us to high-end boutiques just to pretend she belongs in our social strata. Remove her from the premises at once, or I will personally ensure your VIP client list shrinks by half." Julian stood perfectly still. He looked at Brittany, then at Patricia, and finally at me. He looked absolutely terrified, but not of the Vanguard women. He knew exactly who Jonathan was. He knew that the man sitting quietly across from me possessed enough liquid capital to buy the entire building and fire everyone in it before lunch. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up. I picked up my delicate porcelain cup and took a slow, leisurely sip of my espresso. "It is quite all right, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy tension in the room with icy calm. "Please allow them to shop. Let them try on whatever they desire. I would hate to ruin their special morning." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, resting his chin on his steepled fingers. A cold, predatory smile spread across his face as he watched the two women. He looked at them the same way a hawk looks at a wounded mouse. Brittany let out a loud, theatrical scoff, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "You hear that, Julian? The charity case is giving you permission to do your job. Fetch me the crimson Valentino gown from the window display, and bring me the diamond tennis bracelets from the vault. I am going to buy the entire collection just to prove how entirely pathetic her little act is." For the next 45 minutes, Patricia and Brittany treated the boutique like their own personal kingdom. They demanded endless alterations, complained about the champagne temperature, and tossed thousands of dollars worth of delicate fabrics onto the floor. I remained seated on the emerald sofa, quietly reviewing a digital ledger on my tablet, with Jonathan entirely unbothered by their frantic, desperate performance. Finally, Brittany strutted up to the polished glass checkout counter. She carried a massive pile of silk gowns, diamond accessories, and imported leather shoes. Patricia stood right beside her, beaming with arrogant pride. "That will be $30,400. Julian stated, his voice tight and devoid of its usual warmth. Brittany did not even blink. She pulled out her heavy metallic Vanguard corporate platinum card and slapped it onto the glass counter. "Ring it up, Julian, and make sure the receipt is itemized. I want my father to see exactly how much I shine." Julian picked up the heavy card and slid it into the card reader. The machine processed for 3 agonizing seconds before emitting a sharp, harsh, negative beep. The screen flashed a bright red error message. Brittany frowned, tapping her manicured nails impatiently against the glass. "Your machine is broken. Run it again." Julian ran the card a second time. The same harsh negative tone echoed through the silent boutique. The red light blinked relentlessly. Brittany's face flushed with immediate embarrassment and rising anger. "This is completely unacceptable. That is a corporate platinum account. There is no limit. You are doing it wrong." Patricia let out a heavy, irritated sigh and stepped forward, pushing her daughter slightly aside. "Honestly, Brittany, do not argue with the help. The bank is likely just doing a routine fraud check because of the high amount." She opened her designer wallet and pulled out her personal, ultra-exclusive black card. "Use this one, Julian, and I expect a discount for the inconvenience." Julian took Patricia's card with a trembling hand. He inserted it into the reader. Beep. The machine rejected it instantly. Patricia's arrogant posture shattered. Her eyes went wide, darting from the machine to Julian's face. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice rising in genuine panic. "Run it again. Run it right now." Julian did not run the card again. He looked down at the point of sale terminal. A secondary, highly unusual alert had popped up directly from the merchant banking system. He stared at the screen, swallowing hard, before slowly opening the drawer beneath the register. He pulled out a heavy pair of silver tailoring scissors. "What are you doing?" Brittany shrieked, backing away from the counter. Julian picked up the Vanguard Platinum card and Patricia's black card. With 2 swift, brutal metallic snips, he cut both cards cleanly in half. The plastic pieces clattered onto the glass counter. "I am sorry, ma'am," Julian said, his voice dropping to a somber, apologetic whisper. "Your bank has frozen all your accounts." The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. Brittany gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. Patricia stopped breathing entirely. Her face turned the color of chalk. The absolute reality of the situation crashed down upon her, crushing her wealthy, untouchable illusion into dust. The money was gone. The power was gone. Gregory had not suffered a minor setback. He had lost everything. Slowly, mechanically, Patricia whipped her head around to look across the boutique. I was still sitting on the emerald velvet sofa. I lowered my espresso cup, placed it gently onto the matching saucer, and looked directly into my adoptive mother's terrified eyes. I smirked. Patricia stood frozen in Maison Vinay for exactly 5 seconds before the sheer weight of public humiliation broke her paralysis. She grabbed Brittany by the wrist, her fingernails digging into her daughter's skin, and dragged her out of the boutique. They practically fled past the massive glass displays, leaving the shredded remains of their financial identity sitting on Julian's pristine counter. They did not speak a single word during the agonizing drive back to the Pine Valley estate. Brittany sobbed in the back of the town car, mourning the loss of $30,000 worth of silk and diamonds, rather than questioning why their limitless wealth had suddenly evaporated. When they burst through the heavy oak front doors of the mansion, the illusion of their perfect life was already actively shattering. The grand living room was a scene of absolute devastation. Gregory sat slumped on the imported white leather sofa. He looked entirely broken. His custom-tailored suit jacket was crumpled on the floor. His silk tie hung loosely around his neck, and he clutched a half-empty crystal glass of scotch with trembling fingers. Patricia marched directly up to him, her face tight with a frantic, unhinged desperation. "Gregory, look at me right now," she demanded, her voice cracking. "Julian just cut up my personal card in front of Caroline and half the boutique staff. Tell me this is a bank error. Fix this immediately." Gregory did not look up. He took a slow, heavy swallow of his drink. "There is no error, Patricia. The bank called in the loans. The primary accounts are frozen. The Vanguard merger is dead." Patricia staggered backward as if he had physically struck her. "What are you saying?" "I am saying we are bankrupt," Gregory roared, finally looking at her with bloodshot, terrified eyes. "The private equity firm seized everything. The house, the cars, the offshore accounts. We have absolutely nothing left. Brittany let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She threw her designer handbag across the room, watching it smash into a priceless Ming vase. Bankrupt. What do you mean bankrupt? The gala is tomorrow night. All of my friends are going to be there. How am I supposed to show my face if I am wearing last season's collection? My entire life is ruined. She fell to her knees on the Persian rug, throwing a violent, childish tantrum. She pounded her fists against the floor, screaming about her social status, her lost gowns, and the absolute injustice of being deprived of her luxury lifestyle. She did not care that her father was facing federal prison. She only cared that her credit limit had vanished. The heavy wooden doors of the living room swung open. Donovan walked in, his posture perfectly straight, his expression entirely devoid of emotion. He was dressed in a sharp navy suit, holding a leather overnight bag in his right hand. He looked like a man preparing for a routine business trip, completely unaffected by the chaos unfolding around him. Brittany scrambled to her feet the second she saw her husband. Her face was streaked with mascara. She ran across the room and grabbed the lapels of his jacket, her voice desperate and pleading. "Donovan, thank God you are here. My father is having a complete breakdown. You have to fix this. Transfer funds from your personal accounts right now. Pay the bank. Save us." Donovan looked down at his wife's hands clutching his suit. He slowly reached up and peeled her fingers away, pushing her back with a cold, terrifying detachment. He looked at her with absolute, unadulterated disgust. "My money?" Donovan asked, his voice dripping with venom. "You mean the money you gambled away?" Brittany froze, her mouth hanging open in sheer shock. Patricia turned around, staring at her son-in-law in disbelief. "Do not look so surprised," Brittany, Donovan stated, stepping away from her as if she carried a disease. "I read the subsidiary contract Caroline signed. I saw the alphanumeric code. I know exactly how you incurred a $200,000 debt with an underground syndicate. You are a reckless, entitled liability. I tolerated your insufferable vanity because Vanguard was a stepping stone for my career. With the company dead, you offer me absolutely zero value. My lawyers will send the divorce papers to whatever cheap apartment you end up renting." He adjusted his cuffs, stepped completely over the shattered pieces of the Ming vase, and walked out the front door without looking back. Brittany collapsed onto the floor, wailing uncontrollably. The cool evening air washed over the circular driveway of the estate. I was standing next to my car, leaning against the door, waiting. I had driven over from the boutique not to gloat, but to observe the final collapse of the structure that had held me prisoner for 30 years. Donovan emerged from the front doors, his leather bag in hand. He spotted me immediately. He did not walk toward his own vehicle. He changed his trajectory, marching across the crushed gravel until he was standing directly in front of me. The polished professional mask he wore in the boardroom was completely gone. In its place was the face of a ruthless, calculating predator. "I know you orchestrated this," Donovan said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous murmur. "Gregory is too arrogant and too stupid to trigger a cross-collateralization clause. You built the trap. You forced the covenant breach. You burned Vanguard to the ground." I looked at him calmly, showing absolutely no fear. "Your point, Donovan." He stepped closer, invading my personal space, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. "My point is that I just lost a $20 million commission on the merger because of your little revenge plot. I am not walking away empty-handed. I know you control the private equity firm that bought the debt. I know you are sitting on a mountain of liquidated assets." Donovan leaned down, his eyes hard and unyielding. "I want $2 million from whatever payout you are getting, or I take the backup hard drives to the police and claim you were the one embezzling. I will tell the federal investigators that you manipulated the books to frame him. You have exactly 48 hours to wire the funds. Caroline or I will gladly watch you go to federal prison in his place." Donovan stood under the harsh glare of the driveway security lights, his chest puffed out with arrogant certainty. He flashed a brilliant, charismatic, ruthless smile. It was the exact same smile he used in boardrooms right before he gutted a rival firm and sold off its parts. He genuinely believed he had cornered me. He thought he was the ultimate apex predator swooping in to extort the quiet, obedient adopted daughter who had dared to step out of line. He waited for my reaction. He expected me to pale, to stammer, to negotiate. He expected the fear that his father-in-law had always commanded. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. Instead, I kept my breathing perfectly even. The cool night air swirled around us, carrying the faint, chaotic sounds of Brittany's muffled shrieks from inside the mansion. I slowly unclasped the brass lock of my sleek leather tote bag. "You really think you are the smartest person in the room, do you not?" "Donovan?" I asked, my voice calm, maintaining a steady conversational volume that contrasted sharply with his aggressive posturing. "I do not think Caroline." "I know," he replied, taking another step forward, his expensive leather shoes crunching loudly against the gravel. "You executed a brilliant maneuver against Gregory. I will give you credit for that. It was ruthless. But you left a trail. Those backup hard drives are your death warrant. $2 million is a bargain for your freedom. Wire the funds and you get to walk away and play CEO at your new little private equity firm. Refuse, and the FBI gets a highly detailed anonymous tip tomorrow morning." I pulled a silver iPad from my bag. The screen illuminated my face in the darkness. "You are a smart guy, Donovan," I said smoothly, tapping the screen to unlock it. "You married into a dying empire, recognized the rot immediately, and positioned yourself to extract maximum capital before the walls caved in. You saw Gregory's massive pension fraud and decided to use it as a smokescreen." Donovan's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes darted to the tablet in my hands. "What are you talking about?" "I am the forensic accountant who audited the books," I stated, raising the iPad so the speaker faced him directly. "I spent 6 months buried in the raw data of Vanguard Holdings. I saw every single hidden ledger. I tracked every digital footprint. You did not just find Gregory's embezzlement, you skimmed off the top." I pressed play. A crisp, incredibly clear audio recording pierced the quiet night. It was Donovan's voice, completely unmistakable, speaking in a rapid, hushed tone. "Initiate the transfer through the Cayman shell," the recorded Donovan commanded. "Gregory just moved another $2 million from the employee pension fund to cover the commercial real estate margins. Skim $400,000 from the transit account and route it to my personal offshore ledger before the encryption locks. He is too panicked about his own fraud to notice the missing decimal points. Just execute the trade before the quarterly audit." Another voicemail, and heavily accented, replied on the recording. "The transaction is complete, Mr. Donovan. The funds are untraceable. Perfect. Keep monitoring his transfers. We drain the well before it dries up." I tapped the screen, pausing the audio. The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. Donovan's charismatic, ruthless smile vanished completely. The blood rushed out of his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified shell of the man who had just threatened me moments ago. He stared at the iPad as if it were a loaded weapon aimed directly at his chest. "How?" Donovan breathed, his voice stripped of all its commanding authority. His hands slowly balled into fists, trembling with a mixture of shock and sheer panic. "That was a highly encrypted, secure line. That audio is impossible to obtain." "Nothing is impossible when you are the network administrator tasked with upgrading the company's cybersecurity protocols," I replied coldly. "Gregory handed me the master keys to the castle because he thought I was too docile to understand what I was looking at. You made the exact same mistake. You thought you were the only predator in the water. You thought I was just collateral damage." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. He instinctively took a step back, his towering frame suddenly seeming small and defensive. "You committed massive wire fraud, illegal insider trading, and corporate espionage." I listed his crimes with surgical detachment. "You used a federally insured pension fund as your personal piggy bank. That recording is not just a piece of leverage, Donovan. It is a one-way ticket to a maximum security federal penitentiary. The SEC and the FBI will not just seize your assets, they will seize your entire life." He swallowed hard. His eyes darted frantically around the dark driveway, calculating his options and finding absolutely none. The aggressive extortionist was gone. He was trapped, and he knew it. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cracking. You want the 2 million back? I can wire it to you tonight. I can make you whole. I do not want your money, I said, looking at him with absolute disgust. I am offering you a deal. You have exactly one path out of this driveway that does not end with you in handcuffs. He stood perfectly still, hanging on my every word. Name it. First, you file for divorce from Brittany tomorrow morning, I commanded. You leave her with absolutely nothing. Let her drown in the reality of her own uselessness. Second, you hand over every single backup hard drive you took from Gregory's safe. You relinquish all of your supposed leverage immediately. And third, when the federal investigators tear Vanguard Holdings apart next week, you will fully cooperate. You will testify against Gregory in open court, and you will ensure he never sees the outside of a prison cell again. I lowered the iPad, staring directly into his terrified, desperate eyes. You do exactly as I say. I finished, my tone laced with ice. And I will not send this audio file to the FBI. You get to walk away and keep your freedom. You cross me, you try to extort me again, or you warn Gregory and I will ruin you before you can even pack your bags. Donovan looked at the illuminated screen of the tablet, then up at me. His mind processed the ultimatum with the cold, rapid logic of a survivor. He had no loyalty to Brittany. He certainly had no loyalty to Gregory. His only allegiance was to himself. He took a deep breath, forcing his trembling hands to steady. He extended his right hand toward me. Deal. I did not shake his hand. I simply turned around, walked to my car, and left him standing alone in the dark. The heavy mahogany clock in Gregory's study ticked with the deafening rhythm of an executioner's drum. He sat entirely paralyzed behind his massive desk, staring blindly at the dark, polished wood. He had exactly 24 hours. By tomorrow morning, the Securities and Exchange Commission would officially freeze his remaining personal assets. Federal investigators would swarm the Vanguard Holdings building, tearing through servers and seizing financial ledgers. The reality of his situation was absolute. Donovan had vanished, likely securing his own immunity. The private equity firm had locked the corporate accounts. Gregory was entirely out of moves. He slowly opened the bottom drawer of his desk, his trembling fingers brushing against the cold, heavy steel of his registered revolver. Federal prison was not a place a man like Gregory could survive. He was a creature of country clubs and imported scotch, not concrete cells. He closed his eyes, preparing to make the final, cowardly exit strategy he had been contemplating all night. Then the sharp, piercing ring of his private desk phone shattered the silence. Gregory gasped, his hand jerking away from the open drawer. He stared at the blinking light on the console. Nobody used that private line except his most elite, heavily vetted brokers. He snatched the receiver with a desperate, sweaty grip. Mr. Vanguard, a smooth, professionally detached voice spoke on the other end. My name is Sterling. I represent Apex Capital Management. We are a private offshore holding firm, and we are heavily invested in ensuring the Vanguard merger goes through tomorrow. Gregory felt his heart slam against his ribs. He did not recognize the name Apex Capital, nor did he care to ask for their corporate prospectus. He was a drowning man, and someone had just thrown him a life raft. I am listening. Gregory choked out, his voice hoarse. We are aware of your immediate liquidity crisis. Sterling continued seamlessly. My employer is prepared to offer a total comprehensive bailout. We will inject the exact capital required to satisfy your private equity debt, replace the missing pension funds, and completely pacify the SEC auditors before the freeze initiates tomorrow. We require a controlling stake in the new merged entity, of course. It was a miracle. It was an impossible divine intervention. A seasoned, rational CEO would have immediately questioned the origin of the funds, the identity of the mysterious backer, and the sheer convenience of the timing. Gregory was none of those things. He was a terrified, arrogant man who believed he was inherently destined to win. Yes, Gregory breathed, leaning over his desk, his eyes wide with manic relief. Yes, I accept. Whatever the terms are, I accept them. Excellent, Sterling replied. We require your physical signature to authorize the wire transfers. Come to the top floor of the Obsidian Tower downtown at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Do not be late. The line went dead. Gregory slowly placed the receiver down. A wild, hysterical laugh bubbled up from his chest. He slammed the desk drawer shut, hiding the revolver, and practically sprinted out of the study. In the devastated living room, the atmosphere was a toxic funeral dirge. Patricia was frantically shoving imported jewelry into a designer duffel bag, preparing to flee to a secondary vacation home before the banks seized it. Brittany was still on the floor, weeping violently over Donovan's brutal departure and the loss of her social standing. "Stop crying!" Gregory bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Put the jewelry down, Patricia. We are saved." Patricia froze, a diamond necklace dangling from her fingers. Brittany looked up, her mascara smeared across her cheeks. "I just secured a total bailout," Gregory announced, pacing the floor with a renewed, arrogant strut. "A massive offshore firm is covering our debt. The SEC audit is dead in the water. The Vanguard merger is moving forward, and we are going to walk into that gala tomorrow night exactly as we planned. We are untouchable." The transformation in the two women was instantaneous and genuinely terrifying. The panic, the tears, and the sheer terror of poverty vanished in a matter of seconds. It was as if the last 12 hours of absolute ruin had never happened. Patricia dropped the duffel bag, her posture snapping back into a rigid, haughty stance. She smoothed down her skirt and let out a cold, sharp laugh. "I knew it," Patricia declared, her eyes flashing with renewed cruelty. "I knew a family of our stature could not be brought down by a stray, ungrateful rat like Caroline." Brittany scrambled to her feet. The weeping, abandoned wife was gone. The vicious, entitled heiress was back in full force. She grabbed her phone from the coffee table, her manicured thumbs flying across the screen with aggressive speed. "What are you doing?" Gregory asked. "I am texting the charity case," Brittany sneered, her face twisted into an ugly smile. "She thinks she won. I am going to remind her exactly what her place is." Across the city, my phone illuminated on the kitchen counter. I picked it up, staring at the message glowing on the screen. "You honestly thought your little stunt would ruin us? We just secured a billionaire backer. Vanguard is untouchable. As soon as the ink dries tomorrow, my father is unleashing our corporate lawyers. We are suing you for defamation, corporate sabotage, and emotional distress. You will be sleeping on the streets by the end of the month. Enjoy your brief moment, parasite." I read the text twice. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I locked the screen and placed the phone back on the counter. They had taken the bait with absolute spectacular precision. The next morning, Gregory walked into the lobby of the Obsidian Tower like a conquering emperor. He wore a freshly pressed imported Italian suit. His head was held high. He stepped into the private executive elevator and rode it all the way to the penthouse level. The polished steel doors slid open, revealing a breathtaking glass-walled boardroom that overlooked the entire financial district. At the far end of the massive oak conference table, a high-backed leather executive chair was turned away from the door, facing the sprawling city skyline. "Good morning," Gregory announced, projecting his voice across the room with ultimate authority. "Gregory Vanguard, I am here to sign the equity transfer documents and finalize the bailout." The room was perfectly silent. Slowly, deliberately, the high-backed leather chair spun around. Gregory's confident smile froze. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. His briefcase slipped from his fingers, hitting the carpeted floor with a heavy thud. Sitting in the chair was Jonathan. He was the man Gregory had ruthlessly framed for corporate fraud. The man Gregory had sent to federal prison to cover his own tracks. Jonathan wore a flawless dark suit, resting his hands casually on the armrests, looking at Gregory with eyes as cold and unforgiving as shattered ice. Gregory tried to step backward, his breath catching in his throat, but his legs refused to move. The shock paralyzed his nervous system. Then a side door near the window opened. I stepped into the boardroom wearing a tailored black suit. I walked calmly past the floor-to-ceiling windows and took my place standing directly next to Jonathan. In my right hand, I held the thick, legally binding bailout contract that Gregory was so desperate to sign. I looked down at the man who had tormented me for my entire life, watching the absolute realization of his total destruction wash over him. "Welcome to Apex Capital, Gregory," I said smoothly, dropping the contract onto the oak table. "Please take a seat. We have so much to discuss." The paralyzing shock holding Gregory hostage finally snapped, immediately replaced by a primal, blinding surge of pure survival instinct. He did not sit down. He did not say a single word. He spun around on his expensive Italian leather shoes and lunged for the heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom. He intended to run, to flee into the executive elevator and vanish before the reality of the situation could fully consume him. He barely made it 3 steps. The heavy doors swung shut with a sharp, echoing thud. 2 massive corporate security guards stepped directly in front of the exit. They wore immaculate black suits and earpieces, their expressions completely blank and entirely unforgiving. They crossed their arms, forming an impenetrable human wall. The electronic lock on the door engaged with a loud, definitive click. Gregory staggered backward, his chest heaving, as he realized the absolute finality of his predicament. He was trapped in a glass cage 40 stories above the city. He slowly turned back around to face the conference table. Jonathan stood up. He buttoned his dark suit jacket with a slow, deliberate calmness that radiated terrifying authority. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. 30 years ago, you took my freedom, and my daughter Jonathan stated, his voice ringing through the silent room like a death knell. You built your pristine, untouchable reputation on the bones of my career. You falsified those shipping manifests. You bribed the corporate auditors. You stood in a federal courtroom and swore under oath that I was the sole architect of the embezzlement. I spent 10 years in a concrete cell while you lived in a mansion paid for by my hard work. Today I take everything else. Gregory was sweating profusely now. The moisture beaded on his forehead and soaked into the collar of his custom shirt. His eyes darted wildly between Jonathan and me. He raised his hands in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender, desperately trying to construct a narrative that would save his life. "Jonathan, you have to understand the pressure I was under," Gregory pleaded, his voice cracking with rising panic. The board was going to liquidate the entire firm. I did what I had to do to save the company, but I made sure Caroline was safe. I protected her. When you went away, I took her into my own home. I gave her a roof over her head. I fed her. I clothed her. She was raised alongside my own daughter. I gave her an incredible life. I did not let him finish his sickening delusion. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I slammed it down onto the polished oak table with a crack that made Gregory physically flinch. I flipped the folder open and spread the contents out violently across the wood, pushing them directly under Gregory's sweating face. They were not financial ledgers. They were photographs. There were pictures of a 7-year-old girl with dark, violent purple bruises wrapping entirely around her upper arms. Bruises from where Gregory had viciously grabbed me and dragged me out of sight during a high society dinner because I had dared to ask for a second portion of food. There were photographs of a split lip and a swollen eye from when Patricia had hurled a heavy crystal glass at my head in a fit of inexplicable rage. Next to the photographs, I dropped a stack of faded, itemized medical bills from the free public clinic down the street from the Pine Valley estate. "You did not give me an incredible life, Gregory," I said, my voice dead cold and razor sharp. I pointed to the medical records. "You refused to put me on your premium family health insurance. These bills detail untreated asthma, a fractured wrist you claimed was a clumsy fall, and clinical malnutrition. While you were buying Britney-imported sports cars and diamond tennis bracelets, I was sleeping in an unheated basement room on a mattress that smelled of mildew." Gregory stared at the photographs. His mouth opened and closed, but his throat was completely dry. He had spent decades convincing himself that he was a benevolent savior. Being confronted with the undeniable documented proof of his own monstrous cruelty stripped away his final layer of defense. "You did not raise me," I continued, stepping around the table until I was standing just inches away from him. "You kept a hostage. You needed me under your roof because you needed to control the narrative. You needed to monitor the daughter of the man you framed to ensure she never uncovered the truth. You stole my father's life to build your empire, and you used my childhood as a convenient punching bag for your wife and daughter. I reached down and picked up the thick stack of legal documents I had dropped on the table earlier. I slid them across the smooth oak surface until they bumped against Gregory's trembling fingers. I placed a heavy gold fountain pen directly on top of the signature line. This document is a total unconditional surrender. I explained, my tone strictly business. It signs over 100% of Vanguard Holdings to Apex Capital. It also transfers the deed to your primary residence in Pine Valley, your secondary vacation properties in Aspen and Monaco, your personal investment portfolios, your fleet of luxury vehicles, and every single offshore account you possess. Gregory stared at the contract as if it were coated in lethal poison. He shook his head frantically. You cannot do this. You are stealing my entire life. I will have nothing left. I am reclaiming exactly what you stole from us. I corrected him. And you have exactly two choices right now. You pick up that pen and sign away your empire. If you do, I will call off the SEC auditors. I will drop the corporate sabotage charges. You get to walk out of this building a free, completely bankrupt man. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the table. If you refuse, I whispered, the 3 federal agents currently sitting in the lobby downstairs will come up to this floor. They have Donovan's audio recording detailing your illegal insider trading. They have the internal ledgers proving your massive pension fraud. And they have the direct routing numbers to your Cayman shell companies. You are looking at 85 counts of wire fraud and 20 counts of money laundering. You will be arrested, processed, and denied bail before you can even call your lawyer. You will die in federal prison. The air in the boardroom felt impossibly thin. Gregory was suffocating. He looked at the unblinking security guards blocking the door. He looked at Jonathan, who stood like a silent, immovable statue of judgment. He looked down at the contract that would erase 30 years of stolen wealth in a matter of seconds. A heavy bead of sweat rolled down Gregory's temple, dropping onto the pristine white paper of the contract. His chest heaved in rapid, shallow breaths as his reality completely collapsed. Slowly, with a hand shaking so violently he could barely control his own fingers, Gregory reached for the gold pen. The heavy gold pen felt impossibly heavy in Gregory's grip. The metal slipped against his sweat-drenched skin. He looked down at the signature line. It was not just a line of ink, it was the total erasure of his identity. He pressed the nib to the paper. His hand shook so violently that the first letter of his name was an illegible, jagged scratch. He choked on his own breath, a wet, pathetic sound echoing in the immaculate glass boardroom. He signed the first page, then the second, then the asset transfer forms for the Pine Valley estate, the offshore accounts, the fleet of vehicles. With every stroke, a piece of his empire vanished. When he finally reached the last page, the pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the oak table. Gregory slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. A raw, ugly sob tore from his throat. The great, untouchable Gregory Vanguard was reduced to a weeping, broken shell, crying openly in front of the man he had framed and the girl he had abused. Jonathan did not smile. He simply reached forward, gathered the signed documents, and handed them to the corporate security guard standing by the door. "File these immediately," Jonathan commanded, his voice devoid of any pity. I looked down at the sobbing man. There was no satisfaction, only the cold, clinical finality of a long overdue eviction. "Stop crying, Gregory," I stated, my tone snapping like a whip. "You are wasting time. You have exactly 1 hour to clear your personal belongings out of the Pine Valley mansion. When the clock strikes 10, the local authorities will enforce a trespassing order against anyone remaining on my property." Gregory raised his tear-stained red face. "Where am I supposed to go?" he begged, his voice a pathetic wheeze. "I have no cash. My cards are tied to the firm." "That is entirely your problem," I replied, turning my back on him. "Security will escort you to the street. Your 60 minutes starts right now." Miles away, sunlight poured through the massive 2-story arched windows of the Pine Valley estate, illuminating the imported Italian marble floors and the priceless modern art adorning the walls. In the opulent sunken living room, the atmosphere was a jubilant celebration. Patricia reclined on the white silk sofa, elegantly holding a crystal flute filled with a rare $5,000 vintage champagne. Across from her, Brittany was pacing the length of the Persian rug, practically buzzing with arrogant, triumphant energy. I almost wish I could be there when she gets the news, Brittany gloated, pausing to take a large sip of her drink. I want to see the exact moment Caroline realizes she is nothing. She actually thought she could outsmart my father. She thought she could take Vanguard. Patricia let out a soft, dismissive laugh, taking a delicate sip of her champagne. People like Caroline always overplay their hand. They are desperate and emotional. Your father is a tactician. He built a fortress. Did she really believe she could breach it with a few stolen backup drives? The audacity is almost amusing. Brittany checked her diamond-encrusted watch. The wire transfer from the offshore firm should be processing right now. The SEC will pack up their briefcases and crawl back to Washington. I need to call the country club and ensure our reservation for tonight is confirmed. We need to be seen immediately. Absolutely, Patricia agreed, swirling the golden liquid in her glass. We project total invulnerability. We show the board and the city that Vanguard Holdings is stronger than ever. A heavy rhythmic thud echoed from the grand sweeping staircase in the foyer. Brittany turned, her perfect smile widening as she expected to see her husband descending to join the celebration. Donovan appeared at the top of the stairs, but he was not wearing his usual relaxed morning attire. He was dressed in a sharp, dark traveling suit. In each hand he carried a massive, heavily packed designer suitcase. His face was a mask of cold, unreadable stone. He walked down the marble steps, the wheels of the luggage clicking sharply in the quiet foyer. "Donovan," Brittany called out, stepping out of the living room with her champagne flute. "Where are you going? Are you heading to the airport to meet the offshore contacts? My father said the bailout was already secured." Donovan did not stop walking until he reached the center of the foyer. He dropped the heavy suitcases onto the marble floor. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He held it out toward her, his eyes entirely devoid of emotion or affection. "What is this?" Brittany asked, her smile faltering as she stared at the brown envelope. She did not take it. "I am leaving you, Brittany," Donovan stated. His voice was completely flat, a business transaction closing out. "Those are divorce papers. They have already been filed with the county clerk." Patricia stood up from the silk sofa, her champagne spilling slightly over the rim of the crystal glass. "Donovan, what kind of sick joke is this?" "There is no joke, Patricia," Donovan replied smoothly, turning his chilling gaze to his mother-in-law. "And there is no bailout. Gregory did not meet with an offshore investor this morning. He walked blindly into a trap set by Caroline. The SEC freeze is absolute. The corporate accounts are gone. The personal portfolios are drained." Brittany dropped her glass. It shattered against the marble floor, sending shards of crystal and expensive champagne spraying across the foyer. "You are lying!" Brittany shrieked, taking a step backward. "My father said we were saved. He said the merger was moving forward." "Your father is a desperate, arrogant fool who just signed away his entire existence to avoid a federal prison sentence," Donovan countered, stepping closer and shoving the manila envelope hard against Brittany's chest. "You are broke, Brittany. You have absolutely nothing left. Vanguard Holdings belongs to Caroline. This mansion belongs to Caroline. Your credit cards have already been deactivated." Brittany stared at him, her chest heaving as the words slowly penetrated her delusion. "And you are just leaving me here. We are married. We are supposed to be a team." "I married into a dynasty," Donovan replied, picking up his suitcases. "I did not marry a liability. I secured my own exit strategy. You and your mother are on your own." The shock finally shattered, replaced by a surge of violent, hysterical rage. Brittany let out a blood-curdling scream and lunged at him. She swung her manicured hands like claws, aiming directly for his face, completely abandoning her high society poise in a fit of feral desperation. Donovan barely reacted. He effortlessly stepped aside, letting her momentum carry her forward. He caught her by the wrist, twisting it sharply, just enough to send her stumbling to her knees on the hard marble floor. He did not look back as he walked out the heavy mahogany front doors, pulling his luggage behind him. Brittany sobbed on the floor, clutching the divorce papers, screaming his name as the heavy doors slammed shut. Patricia rushed to her daughter's side, her face pale with mounting terror. Before either woman could process the reality of their sudden poverty, a deep rumbling vibration shook the front windows. Patricia looked up, her eyes widening in absolute horror. Through the massive glass panes overlooking the circular driveway, she watched Donovan's sports car speed away. Immediately filling the space he left behind was a massive fleet of vehicles. 3 heavy-duty commercial moving trucks rumbled up the paved driveway, their air brakes hissing loudly. Flanking them were 4 local police cruisers, their red and blue lights flashing silently in the morning sun, casting eerie shadows across the manicured lawns. The lead vehicle, a sleek black town car, pulled to a stop directly in front of the main entrance. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. I stepped out into the crisp morning air, adjusting the cuffs of my black suit. I looked up at the sprawling, opulent mansion that had served as my childhood prison. It was no longer a fortress. It was mine. The heavy oak doors of the mansion were still echoing from Donovan's departure when I closed the door of the black town car. The gravel crunched loudly under my heels. The morning air was sharp and cold, a perfect match for the ice flowing through my veins. I stood flanked by the imposing figures of local law enforcement and a fleet of massive commercial moving trucks that entirely blocked the circular driveway. On the grand marble portico, the scene was one of utter delicious devastation. Brittany was still on her knees, sobbing violently over the divorce papers Donovan had thrown at her feet. Patricia, however, was not broken. She was incensed. Her survival instinct manifested as pure, unadulterated entitlement. Patricia's head snapped up. She saw the flashing blue and red police lights reflecting off the pristine white columns of her estate. She saw the moving crews lowering the heavy steel ramps on their trucks, their heavy work boots hitting the driveway with military precision. Then she saw me standing calmly beside the lead cruiser, her face contorted into a mask of absolute unhinged fury. She stormed down the sweeping marble steps, her expensive silk morning gown billowing behind her like a sail caught in a violent storm. "Get off my property this instant," Patricia shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate, entirely abandoning her carefully cultivated high society persona. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face, but she directed her rage at the uniformed officers standing beside me. "Arrest her right now. This woman is trespassing. She has no right to be here. Remove these hideous trucks from my driveway before I call the chief of police and have every single one of you fired." The lead police officer remained completely unfazed by her hysterics. He was a tall, heavily built man with a completely impassive expression. He did not reach for his radio. He did not flinch at her shrill commands. Instead, he calmly unbuttoned his uniform pocket and retrieved a crisp, thick legal document. He took a measured step forward and held it out to her. Patricia slapped the paper away, her rings flashing in the morning light. "I am not taking anything from you. I demand you arrest that girl." The officer simply let the rejected paper fall to the gravel. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a second identical copy, and held it up, forcing her to look at the bold black lettering at the top of the page. "Ma'am," the officer stated, his voice booming with absolute unquestionable authority, "I am serving you with a court-ordered expedited eviction notice. This property, along with all of its contents, is now legally owned by Horizon Trust. You are currently trespassing on private property. You have exactly 30 minutes to vacate the premises, or you will be forcibly removed and charged with criminal trespass." The words hit Patricia like a physical blow to the stomach. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking pale, aged, and hollow. She stared at the officer, then at the official seal on the document, and finally at me. Her mind raced desperately, trying to find a loophole, a threat, a way out of the impossible corner she was trapped in. She found absolutely nothing. Behind her, Brittany's wailing reached a fever pitch. She scrambled down the marble steps, her knees bleeding through the torn fabric of her expensive designer dress. She collapsed onto the gravel beside her mother, clutching her chest as she hyperventilated, her lungs fighting for air. "We have nothing left," Brittany gasped between violent, choking sobs, rocking back and forth on the sharp stones. "Donovan took everything. He left me. He said we are completely broke. He said Caroline took the company. He said she took it all." Patricia looked down at her ruined, hysterical daughter, then back up at me. The impenetrable arrogance finally broke, shattering into a million pieces. The cold, calculating matriarch realized she had absolutely no leverage left. She was looking at the new owner of her empire, the sole architect of her total destruction. The anger vanished, replaced instantly by a sickening, desperate performance of maternal affection. She rushed toward me, her hands reaching out as if to grab my shoulders. The police officer stepped smoothly between us, raising a hand to block her path. Denied physical contact, Patricia fell to her knees on the gravel, placing her right beside her weeping daughter in the dirt. "Caroline, please." Patricia begged, her voice cracking with heavily manufactured anguish. "You cannot do this. We are a family. You grew up in this house. We gave you everything. We fed you, we clothed you, we put a solid roof over your head when you had absolutely no one else in the world. We raised you exactly like you were our own flesh and blood. You cannot put your own mother out on the street. Please, Caroline, have some mercy." I stood perfectly still. The bright morning sun illuminated the pathetic display at my feet. Two women who had made my childhood a living nightmare were now begging for scraps of the compassion they had never once shown me. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt entirely wonderfully liberated. I looked down at Patricia, my expression completely blank and devoid of any warmth. I kept my voice quiet, forcing her to strain to hear the absolute finality in my words. "You are not my mother," I said, the words cutting through the crisp air like sharpened glass. "You are my kidnapper," Patricia gasped, her eyes widening in genuine, unadulterated terror. "You and Gregory stole my father's life." I continued, my voice steady, rhythmic, and relentless. "You framed an innocent man, sent him to a maximum security federal prison, and took me as a hostage to control the narrative. You did not raise me, Patricia. You kept me as a convenient punching bag for your own miserable insecurities. You starved me. You left me with untreated broken bones. You made sure I knew every single day that I was nothing more than collateral damage. But you forgot one very crucial detail about hostages. They eventually grow up, and they learn exactly how to fight back." Patricia slumped forward, her hands covering her face as she joined Brittany in a loud chorus of ruined, absolute despair. They were completely broken. The Vanguard dynasty was officially dead, bleeding out in the dirt of their own driveway. Before I could signal the moving crews to enter the house and begin boxing up my new assets, the sound of a struggling engine broke the morning quiet. A battered yellow city taxi coughed and sputtered as it turned off the main road. It slowly crawled up the long winding driveway, a jarring, entirely out-of-place sight amidst the flashing police cruisers and heavy-duty moving trucks. The taxi screeched to a halt directly behind the lead police car. The rear door popped open. Gregory stepped out. He was a walking corpse. His imported Italian suit, which had been pristine just an hour ago, was deeply wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. His expensive silk tie was missing. His face was a sickly shade of gray, his eyes sunken, bloodshot, and entirely hollow. He had just walked all the way down from the penthouse of the Obsidian Tower, entirely stripped of his corporate armor. His personal driver had abandoned him. His luxury sedans had been seized by my firm. The great billionaire had been forced to hail a public taxi to return to a home he no longer owned. Gregory stood by the open door of the cab. He looked at the massive moving trucks blocking his path. He looked at the flashing police lights illuminating his lawn. He looked at his wife and daughter sobbing on their knees in the gravel like common vagrants. Finally, his dead, exhausted eyes locked onto me. He did not look angry. He did not look surprised. He looked completely, utterly defeated. The fight had been drained entirely out of him, leaving nothing but an empty shell. He slowly reached into his pocket to pay the taxi driver, his hands trembling so violently, he dropped several crumpled bills onto the paved driveway. He took one slow, agonizing step toward his ruined family. He did not make it a second step. The lead police officer, who had been watching the exchange with absolute silence, stepped purposefully toward Gregory. The officer reached to the back of his heavy-duty utility belt. The sharp, metallic clinking sound cut straight through the sound of Brittany and Patricia's crying. The officer pulled out a pair of heavy, shining steel handcuffs. "Gregory Vanguard," the officer stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority, as he grabbed Gregory's arm and twisted it firmly behind his back. You are under arrest for 85 counts of federal wire fraud, 20 counts of money laundering, and corporate espionage. Gregory did not resist. He did not yell for his lawyers. He simply bowed his head, closing his eyes and letting the cold steel snap tightly around his wrists. The cold steel of his handcuffs clicked with absolute finality, locking Gregory Vanguard into a reality he could not buy his way out of. The sound seemed to jolt him out of his defeated stupor. He jerked his arms against the heavy metal chain, his eyes snapping wide open. He stared at the lead officer, then violently twisted his neck to look directly at me. "Wait!" Gregory gasped, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "I signed the papers. I gave you everything. You gave me your word. You said you would drop the SEC charges." I stood perfectly still on the gravel driveway. The morning sun illuminated the complete ruin of the man who had tormented me for my entire life. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of joy, but of surgical, calculated victory. "I did drop the SEC charges, Gregory," I replied, maintaining a steady conversational volume that cut effortlessly through the crisp air. "I called off the federal auditors. I withdrew the corporate sabotage files." Gregory's chest heaved. "Then what is this? Why are they arresting me?" "Because I never said I would not press charges for the theft of a minor's trust fund," I stated, my voice turning to pure ice. Gregory stopped struggling. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. 30 years ago, my grandfather established an irrevocable trust in my name. I continued stepping closer so he could hear every single syllable. He funded it with early investments that multiplied exponentially over the decades. When you framed my father and took me into this house, you did not do it out of charity. You used forged documents and bribed family court judges to gain control of that trust. You drained it to build Vanguard Holdings. You stole a 9-figure fortune from an orphaned child. Gregory opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The absolute magnitude of his crimes had finally caught up to him. "Read him his rights," the lead officer commanded his partner. The second officer grabbed Gregory firmly by the bicep, pushing him toward the back of the waiting police cruiser. Patricia and Brittany screamed in unison from the dirt, their wailing echoing off the marble columns of the mansion. Gregory did not look back at them. He was shoved unceremoniously into the back seat, his head ducked down to avoid the doorframe. The heavy car door slammed shut, severing Gregory Vanguard from his kingdom forever. 14 days later, the atmosphere inside the federal courthouse was suffocating. The combined civil and criminal trials had drawn media from across the country. Reporters crowded the heavy oak double doors of Courtroom 4B, desperate to catch a glimpse of the spectacular downfall of a financial dynasty. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Jonathan, my posture perfectly straight. Across the center aisle, the reality of the past 2 weeks was painted clearly on the faces of my former tormentors. Gregory sat at the defense table. He was no longer wearing imported Italian silk. He wore an ill-fitting standard-issue beige suit provided by his public defender. His private legal team had immediately dropped him when his accounts were frozen. His hair was unkempt, his shoulders permanently slumped under the weight of his impending prison sentence. Behind him in the public gallery sat Patricia and Brittany. The sight of them was almost unrecognizable. Their designer wardrobes, seized along with the estate, were gone. Patricia wore a faded, poorly tailored gray blouse that hung awkwardly on her frame. Brittany was dressed in a cheap, generic retail sweater that looked like it had been pulled from a clearance bin. The flawless blowouts and expensive manicures were a thing of the past. Dark, heavy circles framed their eyes. Their skin looked sallow and exhausted. 2 weeks of living in a budget motel stripped of their wealth and social standing had completely broken them. They looked haggard, terrified, and entirely ordinary. The proceedings had been a relentless surgical dismantling of Gregory's defense. Jonathan and our legal team had presented the financial ledgers, the forged bank transfers, and the offshore routing numbers. We had built an ironclad mountain of evidence proving that Gregory had systematically drained the Harrington Trust to fund his own lavish lifestyle. The jury looked disgusted. The judge looked bored with Gregory's pathetic attempts at denial. The trial was approaching its inevitable crushing conclusion. Then Gregory's public defender stood up. He was a young, sweating attorney who looked entirely out of his depth, but he was backed into a corner with absolutely nothing to lose. He adjusted his tie and approached the judge's bench. "Your Honor." The defense attorney began, his voice shaking slightly. "The prosecution has presented a compelling narrative regarding the movement of funds from the Harrington Trust. However, the entire premise of this civil restitution and the accompanying criminal charges rests on a single unverified assumption." The courtroom fell completely silent. Even Patricia and Brittany sat up straighter in the gallery, sensing a sudden shift in the air. "The defense moves to dismiss all charges related to the theft of the trust," the attorney declared, gripping the edges of the podium. "The trust in question was explicitly established for the direct biological descendants of Walter Harrington. The plaintiff, Caroline, claims to be the rightful beneficiary." The defense attorney turned and pointed a dramatic finger directly at me. "But the plaintiff has absolutely no legal standing in this courtroom," he announced loudly. "We have scoured the public records. There is no birth certificate listing Caroline as the biological child of Jonathan Harrington. There is no DNA evidence linking her to the creator of the fund. We assert that Caroline is not a blood relative of the Harrington family at all. She is an unrelated ward, and therefore Gregory Vanguard committed no crime in reallocating abandoned funds." A loud collective gasp echoed through the gallery. I heard Patricia let out a sharp, sudden bark of laughter from the back rows. Brittany grabbed her mother's arm, a vicious, nasty glimmer of hope suddenly returning to her exhausted eyes. If I was not a legal heir, the entire case against Gregory would collapse. They would get their money back. They would get their mansion back. The judge banged his gavel heavily, cutting through the rising murmur of the crowd. He peered down over the rims of his glasses, his expression stern and questioning. He turned his gaze directly to me. "The defense has raised a significant procedural challenge," the judge stated, his voice booming across the silent room. "Counselor, or Ms. Harrington, do you have a response to this motion? Do you have documented proof of your biological connection to this trust?" Every single camera lens, every reporter, and every pair of eyes in the courtroom locked onto me. Gregory leaned forward in his chair, holding his breath, praying for a miracle. I did not panic. I simply reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a single sealed envelope. I held the heavy cream-colored envelope up so the stark fluorescent lighting of the courtroom caught the official wax seal on the back. The judge leaned forward, his gavel resting loosely in his hand, his eyes locked on the document. The oppressive silence in the room stretched so thin it felt ready to snap. "Your Honor," I stated, my voice echoing off the polished mahogany walls with absolute, unwavering certainty. "The defense is correct about one thing. 30 years of meticulously falsified paperwork creates a very compelling illusion. Gregory Vanguard spent millions of dollars building a paper fortress to hide his crimes. But biology does not lie, and neither does the man who has waited 3 decades to finally speak his truth." I turned away from the trembling public defender and faced the center aisle. I called Jonathan Harrington to the stand. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a deep, resonating groan. The collective intake of breath from the packed gallery sounded like a vacuum suddenly pulling all the oxygen from the room. Patricia gripped the wooden railing in front of her so hard, her knuckles turned a stark, translucent white. Brittany stared in mute, paralyzed horror, her mouth slightly open. At the defense table, Gregory physically recoiled. He shrank back into his chair, his oversized, generic beige suit suddenly looking entirely too large for his rapidly diminishing frame. Jonathan walked down the center aisle. He did not rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who knew he held the ultimate executioner's blade. He wore a sharp charcoal gray suit that fit him perfectly, a stark contrast to Gregory's pathetic appearance. Jonathan walked past the defense table without offering Gregory a single glance. He climbed the steps to the witness box, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the whole truth. I handed the sealed envelope to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge for inspection, before passing it to Jonathan. "Mr. Harrington," I began, standing squarely in front of the podium, "could you please open that envelope and read the findings of the court-ordered examination conducted by the Independent Federal Laboratory last week?" Jonathan broke the seal. He pulled out the crisp, watermarked document. He did not need to read it to know what it said, but he held it up for the official record. This is a legally binding court-certified DNA analysis. Jonathan announced, his deep voice commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. The results confirm a 99.9% probability. Caroline is my sole biological daughter. She is the direct, undeniable blood descendant of Walter Harrington and the sole rightful heir to the $50 million Harrington Trust. The gallery erupted into a frenzy of frantic whispering. Reporters scrambled to type the revelation into their phones. The judge banged his gavel 3 times, the sharp cracks cutting through the noise and forcing the room back into a stunned silence. The public defender looked at Gregory in utter panic. Gregory was sweating profusely now, shaking his head in a rapid, jerky motion, as if trying to physically deny the reality unfolding in front of him. "Mr. Harrington," I continued, stepping closer to the witness box. "The defense claims that Gregory Vanguard merely reallocated abandoned funds. Could you please explain to the court exactly how Gregory gained access to that $50 million trust?" Jonathan turned his piercing gaze directly toward Gregory. The billionaire flinched as if he had been physically struck. "He did not reallocate anything. He orchestrated a masterclass in theft," Jonathan testified, his tone laced with a fierce, tightly controlled anger. 30 years ago, Gregory Vanguard was my business partner. When he discovered the massive irrevocable trust my father had established for my future children, he devised a plan to bleed it dry. But the trust had an ironclad biological inheritance clause. The funds could only be accessed by a blood heir or by the legal guardian of that heir for strictly approved maintenance costs. Jonathan leaned forward, gripping the edges of the witness stand. "Gregory framed me for corporate embezzlement. He planted falsified ledgers in my office and testified against me in federal court. With me out of the way, serving a 10-year sentence in a maximum security prison, he moved to the second phase of his plan. Gregory bribed a corrupt family court judge, a man who was later disbarred and is now deceased, to completely seal and alter my daughter's original birth records." I looked over at Patricia. She was shaking violently, her eyes darting toward the exits as if calculating her chances of escaping the building. "Gregory fabricated adoption and guardianship papers," Jonathan declared to the jury, who were hanging on to his every word. "He legally reclassified my biological daughter as an unrelated ward of the state under his benevolent care. By erasing her true identity, he bypassed the trust's biological restrictions. He claimed millions of dollars per year in exorbitant administrative fees, housing allowances, and legal maintenance costs. He siphoned the Harrington Trust directly into Vanguard Holdings shell companies. He stole my freedom, he stole my daughter, and he used my father's money to build his entire empire." The absolute magnitude of the betrayal hung in the air. The jury looked openly disgusted. The narrative of the benevolent billionaire taking in an orphaned child had just been exposed as a calculated, monstrous kidnapping for profit. Gregory's defense attorney jumped to his feet, knocking a glass of water onto the table in his sheer panic. His face was bright red, his voice cracking with desperation as he launched a Hail Mary attack. "Objection! Objection to this witness's entire testimony!" the young lawyer shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Jonathan. "Your Honor, this is a coordinated character assassination. Jonathan Harrington is a convicted felon. He was found guilty of corporate embezzlement. We are supposed to believe this fantastical conspiracy theory based entirely on the word of an ex-convict who spent a decade behind bars." The judge frowned, looking down at the defense attorney. "The DNA evidence is court-certified, counselor. However, the claims regarding the financial mechanisms and the bribery require corroboration." I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator watching the trap snap shut. I turned away from the panicked defense attorney and faced the judge. "The defense makes a very fair point about credibility, Your Honor," I stated smoothly, my voice ringing with total confidence. "We absolutely need corroboration from someone intimately familiar with the internal modern-day finances of Vanguard Holdings, someone who can verify exactly where the stolen trust money went." I turned my gaze to the back of the courtroom. "I call my second witness." The heavy oak doors swung open once again. Donovan walked into the courtroom. He wore a custom dark navy suit that screamed wealth and power. His posture was impeccable, his expression completely unbothered by the hundreds of eyes suddenly locked onto him. He paused at the back of the center aisle and casually adjusted his designer silk tie. In the gallery, Brittany leaped to her feet. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged fury. She pointed at her estranged husband, her voice tearing through the silent courtroom in a shrill, echoing shriek. "Traitor!" The sharp, echoing crack of the judge's wooden gavel sounded like a gunshot over Brittany's unhinged scream. "One more outburst from the gallery and I will hold you in contempt and have you escorted to a holding cell," the judge roared, his face flushed with severe, uncompromising anger. Two armed bailiffs immediately stepped toward the back row, their hands resting firmly on their duty belts. Brittany snapped her mouth shut, sinking back down into the hard wooden bench. She grabbed Patricia's arm, her chest heaving rapidly as she stared daggers at the man who had just destroyed her last remaining shred of hope. Donovan did not even flinch. He did not look at his estranged wife. He did not look at Gregory, who was currently trembling so hard his chair rattled against the wooden floorboards of the defense table. Donovan walked smoothly to the witness box, placed his right hand flat on the Bible, swore the oath with a perfectly steady voice, and took his seat. He adjusted the microphone, his posture radiating the cold, calculating professionalism that had made him Gregory's most lethal and effective executive. "Please state your name and your former relationship to the defendant for the official court record," I said, stepping up to the polished wooden podium. "Donovan Vance," he replied, his voice echoing cleanly through the courtroom audio system. "Former Chief Financial Officer of Vanguard Holdings and former son-in-law to Gregory Vanguard." "Mr. Vance," I continued, keeping my tone perfectly measured and strictly professional, "you abruptly stepped down from your executive position at Vanguard Holdings shortly before this trial began. Did you bring anything with you when you vacated the building?" Donovan reached inside the inner breast pocket of his tailored dark navy suit jacket. He pulled out 3 black, heavy-duty encrypted hard drives. He placed them deliberately on the wooden ledge of the witness stand. The metallic clack echoed loudly in the totally silent room. "I brought the actual company," Donovan stated. "These physical drives contain the raw, unedited internal financial ledgers of Vanguard Holdings. They completely bypass the sanitized, heavily manipulated reports Gregory regularly submitted to the corporate board and the federal tax authorities. They show the exact routing numbers, the hidden offshore wire transfers, and the shadow accounts he used to hide his theft." Gregory let out a pathetic, strangled gasp. His public defender sank lower in his chair and buried his face in both of his hands, completely giving up on the defense strategy right then and there. "Could you explain to the jury exactly how Gregory Vanguard utilized these shadow accounts?" I asked, gesturing toward the jury box where 12 people sat in totally stunned silence. "Gregory established an intricate network of ghost shell companies in the Cayman Islands." Donovan explained, his tone clinical and detached. "He used his forged fraudulent guardianship papers to access the Harrington Trust. He would authorize massive multi-million-dollar withdrawals under the guise of administrative fees, medical care, and educational maintenance for Caroline. He would funnel that stolen cash directly into the offshore shells, wash it through dummy corporate real estate investments, and then inject it back into Vanguard Holdings to artificially inflate his quarterly profit margins." Donovan pointed a steady finger directly at Gregory. "He did not build a legitimate financial empire. He built a parasitic laundering operation using stolen money." The jury members scribbled furiously on their legal notepads. Several of them cast completely disgusted glares toward the defense table. "Mr. Vance," I said, stepping away from the podium and walking closer to the jury box to ensure they caught the full weight of my next question. "Were Gregory's crimes strictly financial, or was there a calculated physical component to his overall strategy?" Donovan shifted in his seat. The clinical detachment in his eyes vanished rapidly, replaced by a cold, hardened disgust. "Gregory knew that Caroline was the only loose end that could hang him," Donovan testified, his voice dropping to a serious, chilling register. "He knew that if she ever gained personal independence, if she ever hired a lawyer, or possessed the resources to look into her own history, the entire Vanguard empire would instantly collapse. He needed her entirely compliant. He needed her fundamentally broken. I let the heavy silence stretch across the room for a long moment. How did he ensure she remained broken? He implemented what he referred to in private as a containment strategy. Donovan revealed his words, sending a visible shockwave of revulsion through the crowded courtroom. I was present in his private home study when he gave explicit, detailed instructions to his wife Patricia. He told her to keep Caroline small, to keep her perpetually hungry, and to keep her terrified. The physical and mental abuse inflicted upon her was not just Patricia's personal cruelty. It was a mandated corporate strategy to protect stolen assets. Donovan looked directly at the jury, ensuring every single member heard the absolute truth. Gregory explicitly ordered Patricia to systematically destroy Caroline's self-esteem. He weaponized starvation and severe psychological torture to ensure she would never possess the confidence to question her past or fight for her freedom. The courtroom erupted into total chaos. The gallery roared with pure outrage. The jury members looked physically sickened, some covering their mouths in horror. Gregory slumped forward, resting his forehead against the defense table, completely and utterly broken. But Patricia did not surrender. The public revelation of her monstrous, calculated obedience snapped her fragile grip on reality. She leaped to her feet in the back row of the gallery, her face twisted into a demonic purple mask of unhinged fury. "She was a parasite!" Patricia screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice shredding her vocal cords as she completely lost her mind. She lunged violently toward the wooden partitions separating the public gallery from the courtroom floor. "We gave you a home. We fed you our scraps. You ruined our lives. You ruined my daughter. You belong in the gutter where we found you." "Restrain her immediately!" The judge bellowed, his face red with absolute commanding outrage. Two massive court bailiffs rushed forward and tackled Patricia before she could climb over the wooden railing. They grabbed her tightly by the arms, dragging her backward as she kicked and thrashed like a wild, rabid animal. Brittany sat entirely frozen in her seat, sobbing uncontrollably as she watched her mother being aggressively manhandled and handcuffed right in the middle of the crowded gallery. Patricia continued to scream vile, breathless insults until the heavy oak doors closed forcefully behind her, instantly cutting off her unhinged raving. The judge took a deep, shaky breath, running a hand over his tired face. The room slowly quieted down, the heavy tension leaving the air thick and hard to breathe. The judge looked down at the sweating, defeated public defender. "Does the defense have any cross-examination for this witness?" The judge asked, his voice dripping with absolute disdain. The defense lawyer slowly stood up. He looked at Donovan sitting confidently on the stand, then at the encrypted hard drives, and finally at Gregory, who was still hiding his face against the polished wood of the table. "No, Your Honor," the young lawyer whispered, shaking his head. "The defense rests." The judge struck his gavel against the wooden-sounding block with a deafening crack that echoed through the high ceilings of the courtroom. He picked up his pen and stared down at the broken, shivering man sitting at the defense table. The disgust radiating from the judge's eyes was absolute and entirely uncompromising. "In my 20 years on the bench, I have never seen such a despicable abuse of familial trust," the judge declared, his voice echoing with lethal, undeniable authority. He reached across his desk for the thick stack of official sentencing paperwork, preparing to read Gregory Vanguard's ultimate fate. The judge's voice boomed across the silent courtroom, shattering the last remaining fragments of Gregory Vanguard's fraudulent empire. Gregory Vanguard, for the orchestration of decades-long fraud, embezzlement, and the unconscionable manipulation of a minor's identity for personal gain, I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. A collective gasp rippled through the packed gallery. Gregory did not move. He simply stared blankly at the polished wood of the defense table, his chest hollowed out as the judge continued delivering the fatal blow. "Furthermore, I am ordering total and immediate financial restitution to the Harrington Trust," the judge declared, his tone leaving absolutely no room for appeal. "Every corporate asset, offshore account, and piece of real estate associated with Vanguard Holdings is hereby seized by the federal government. This includes the primary Vanguard estate and all personal assets acquired with these stolen funds. You have built a kingdom on the back of a stolen child, Mr. Vanguard. Today that kingdom burns to the ground. The implications hung heavily in the crisp courtroom air. Patricia and Brittany were not just losing their social status or their mansion, they were losing absolutely everything. Their frozen bank accounts, their luxury vehicles, even the expensive designer clothes currently hanging in their massive closets were now the legal property of the federal government. They were utterly destitute. The bailiff stepped forward, pulling Gregory roughly to his feet. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked sharply around his wrists, a mechanical sound that mirrored the finality of his ruin. As the officers turned him toward the center aisle, his panicked eyes desperately sought mine. He looked for anger, for triumph, for any validation that he had mattered in my life, even as a monster. I gave him absolutely nothing. I sat perfectly still beside my father, my posture straight, and my expression entirely blank. I looked right through Gregory Vanguard as if he were made of invisible glass, rendering him completely insignificant. His shoulders slumped the last bit of fight, leaving his pathetic frame as the armed bailiffs marched him out of the courtroom and out of my life forever. The crisp afternoon air hit my face as my father and I walked out the heavy brass doors of the federal courthouse. Reporters swarmed the concrete steps, their camera lenses flashing wildly, but our private security team smoothly directed them away, clearing a wide path to our waiting car. Before we could reach the vehicle, a frantic figure shoved violently past the line of security guards. It was Brittany. Her cheap retail sweater was disheveled, her face streaked with ruined running mascara. Without Donovan's immense wealth, or her father's stolen empire to shield her, she looked exactly like what she was, a desperate, entitled woman who had just realized she had zero actual skills to survive in the real world. "Caroline, wait," Brittany pleaded, her voice cracking as she lunged toward me. One of our security details immediately stepped in her path, raising a firm hand to block her, but I gestured for him to hold. I wanted to hear this. "You took everything," Brittany gasped, tears streaming down her sallow, exhausted cheeks. "Donovan froze our joint accounts and served me with divorce papers. The federal agents locked the gates to the house. Mom is in a holding cell for contempt of court. I have nowhere to go. I have $0 to my name. You run Vanguard now. You have the Harrington money. Just give me a job. Anything. A receptionist, a consultant, I can help you run things." The sheer staggering audacity of her request hung in the air. After a lifetime of tormenting me, of actively participating in my starvation and psychological abuse, she genuinely expected me to throw her a lifeline. I looked at her, truly examining the pathetic wreck of the woman who used to lock me in a dark closet for wearing her discarded clothes. I reached into my designer leather handbag. I did not pull out a business card, a corporate contract, or a checkbook. I pulled out a single crisp $10 bill. I held it out between my index and middle finger. Brittany stared at the money, her lips trembling with fresh, humiliated outrage. "What is this?" "Take an Uber," I stated, my voice devoid of any warmth or emotion. "I hear the downtown homeless shelter fills up extremely fast on weeknights. You should probably hurry." I let the $10 bill flutter from my fingers. It landed gently on the cold concrete steps right at her feet. I turned my back on her, panicked sobbing, and climbed into the sleek black car waiting at the curb. I did not look out the tinted window as we drove away. 6 months later, the bright morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new corner office. The view from the 50th floor was spectacular, offering a sweeping, unobstructed panorama of the entire city skyline. The heavy, oppressive marble walls of the Vanguard estate felt like a distant nightmare, completely replaced by clean lines, modern glass, and the vibrant hum of a legitimate, thriving corporate headquarters. I stood on the expansive private balcony, the crisp wind whipping my hair around my shoulders. The transition had been intense but incredibly rewarding. The Harrington Trust had been fully restored, and we had systematically liquidated the corrupt, parasitic remnants of Vanguard Holdings. From those ashes, my father and I had built a new enterprise grounded in the ethical principles my grandfather had originally intended. The heavy glass doors slid open behind me. Jonathan stepped onto the balcony holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed one to me, his eyes crinkling at the corners with deep, genuine pride. He no longer looked like a man broken by the prison system. He looked healthy, vibrant, and fully restored to his rightful place as an industry leader. The board meeting is in 20 minutes, Jonathan noted, leaning against the metal railing beside me. They are eager to hear the new CEO's quarterly projections. The projections are solid, I replied, taking a sip of the dark coffee. We are expanding our philanthropic divisions by 30% next quarter exactly as we planned. We are also funding 3 new legal advocacy centers for misrepresented wards of the state. You have done an incredible job, Caroline, my father said, his voice thick with emotion. You took everything they broke and built a fortress. I smiled, lowering my coffee cup. I pulled back the sleeve of my tailored dark blue blazer. Resting on my wrist was a beautiful brand new timepiece. It was not a flashy diamond-encrusted monstrosity like the ones Gregory used to flaunt to hide his profound insecurities. It was elegant, precise, and entirely my own, purchased with my own hard-earned executive salary, not stolen trust funds. I watched the second hand tick forward with flawless, unstoppable precision. Every single movement of that tiny dial represented a moment of absolute freedom. Gregory was sitting in an 8x10 federal cell. Patricia and Brittany were irrelevant footnotes completely erased from my reality and struggling to survive in a world that no longer catered to their entitlement. The years of starvation, the psychological torture, and the stolen inheritance were finally dead and buried. I looked out over the sprawling city, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of my own power. I was not a victim. I was not an unrelated ward of the state. I was Caroline Harrington. The past was completely dismantled by the truth, and my future was finally entirely my own. The overarching narrative powerfully illustrates that your true worth is never defined by those who constantly belittle or underestimate you, even if they are family. When faced with toxic dynamics, severe betrayal, or being treated as the designated scapegoat, the most profound lesson is the necessity of choosing yourself. True empowerment comes from stepping away from conditional love and building an independent, authentic life from the ground up. You simply cannot heal in the exact environment that originally broke you, but your ultimate success will always become your greatest justice. Share your own stories of overcoming toxic relationships and comment below.